Expected to begin and actually to continue in just a couple of moments.
Yeah. Call to order the Foreign Relations hearing, and we're going to begin with Senator Booker. Senator Risch ended up having a conflict, so we might reserve time for him when he is able to make it back. And with that, we'll turn to one of our newest members, Senator Booker.
Mr. Chairman, I really appreciate this opportunity. Mr. Tillerson, thank you very much for being here. I think you should mark for the record that it is a testimony to your character that even your in-laws have stuck through this, which is something you rarely see. Sir, I just want to follow up on a few points of testimony that I heard, and I know I had to leave, unfortunately, for two other committees that were meeting at the same time, so I may have missed some of this. But I know that folks are going to get back to some of the issues regarding many of the things we discussed. But I just want to know, U.S. Engage, do you know what USA Engage is?
USA Engage?
Yes.
No, sir, I'm not, it's not ringing a bell with me.
So what my notes here say is that USA Engage is an industry lobbying group for oil companies that did a lot of lobbying. In fact, they worked very hard on lobbying against a lot of the U.S. sanctions that were in place. And you don't know if ExxonMobil is a member of USA Engage and pays into that group for those lobbying purposes?
I do not know.
Okay. Would you be able to find that out for me for the record?
You might want to put the question to ExxonMobil, or if it's not on the lobbying report.
All right. Thank you very much. Another issue before I get into my question, I just want to follow up on. You characterized some of the Obama administration in foreign policy as characterized as weakness, that we didn't show strength around the globe. Is that correct?
I think it's an absence of asserting our leadership, yes, sir.
And you indicated that our response to Russian aggression in eastern Ukraine was one of those indicators of that weakness. Is that correct?
That is my opinion, yes.
Right. And it seemed in the testimony that you were saying that such an aggression should be met with a proportional response that we did not show.
Well, I don't think that's exactly the way I stated it. I think what I indicated in terms of the next step was my view of, it's back to my predictability comment, that Russia is not unpredictable, that when the response to the taking of Crimea was met with, in my estimation, a response that was less than I suspect the leadership of Russia thought they would encounter, then the next move was logical to come across the eastern border of Ukraine, because it was pretty well known that there were elements in eastern Ukraine that already were sympathetic to Russia interest.
And so that might be a case then when they annexed Crimea, entered into eastern Ukraine. This is a sign of weakness because we didn't respond in a way that would deter further actions.
Working with allies in the region and obviously working with the government in Kiev, both.
And so what we did do in those cases was to put together with the Europeans a way of sanctioning them economically, but that was not sufficient in your mind to stop them from their aggressions.
Well, I think, I think you're on to a really important point around sanctions. And obviously there's been a lot of questions about sanctions, and so I think it's good to try to clarify my view on those. As I've said, sanctions are a very powerful tool. They're an important tool. And they can be used in two circumstances. One is to punish someone or country for what they've already done. The other is to intervene and cause them not to do certain things. And in this case, clearly the sanctions that were put in place in response to Crimea did not deter them from entering.
And so, is it your opinion
Ukraine.
Then that our sanctions should have been much more severe, or do you think in that case there should have been a match of equal force? In other words, military action.
The latter was my response. In that situation, given the dramatic taking of Crimea, and that was a dramatic action, sanctions were going to be insufficient to deter the Russian leadership from taking the next step.
And your opinion thinks it should have been military force then?
I'm sorry?
Your opinion then is that it should have been military force?
My opinion is there should have been a show of force, a military response in defensive posture, not an offensive posture, but in defensive posture, to send the message that it stops here. It stops here. And sanctions, in my view, taken after the fact, were not going to be adequate to deter that. Now, that's my opinion. We'll never know.
Right, but you understand
how that would have played out.
You understand that if you put yourself in a defensive posture, there's an old saying that if you pull a gun, you should be prepared to use it, that could quickly escalate into a conflict, and you're going to be making decisions about whether we should have commit American troops, commit European troops. If there's a military response, obviously they weren't putting it forth in Crimea. It would have to come from someplace else. And do you understand that it seems to be that you're advocating for greater use of U.S. military power, greater U.S. military engagement in conflicts like the one we saw in Ukraine?
Senator, I'm advocating for responses that will deter and prevent a further expansion of a bad actor's behavior. I would not in any way want anyone to take away the thought that I recommend that as the first action. And again, in any decision to respond with a show of force, that will be taken within the National Security Council and be fully informed by others, including Department of Defense and intelligence agencies, as to whether that would, in fact, first, can it be executed upon? Can it be effective? But looking at your other options as well. And again, I'm not dismissive of the sanctions.
But you did characterize the Obama administration's decisions as weakness, even though you're saying that you wouldn't necessarily do something different.
In that instance, I would have done something different.
Military force.
A show of force at the border of the country that had already had territory taken from it.
American military force in this case?
No, I indicated Ukrainian military force supported by the U.S. providing them with capable defensive weapons. If that's not seen across the border, then it's not a show of force.
Switching gears now, it is an American value, this value of transparency in government, correct?
Yes.
And accountability in government.
Yes.
I have a concern, it's not a great one, you could allay it right now, that as a leader of a private company, you made it clear in many ways that you were first and foremost accountable to shareholders, employees, and customers. But as the Secretary of State, you're accountable to the American public and would be expected to keep the media, the public, constantly informed of general activities. And I just know that when my staff did a rough calculation of past secretaries' interactions with the press, Clinton had over 3,200 in her 4 years. Secretary Kerry had about 3,000. When you were at ExxonMobil, it was a far, far smaller number, but I imagine as Secretary of State, you believe in the importance of transparency, of engaging with the public, of answering to the questions that often come from the media.
Yes, and I indicated in my opening statement that that's part of earning the public trust, is also to engage with this committee and that's a way to communicate with the public as well.
And so you will bring press corps with you as you travel overseas, and you will commit to having those regular interactions with the press?
If confirmed, I will look into what would be appropriate to take. I've not gotten that far in my thinking.
Okay, so you haven't thought through about issues of accountability and transparency?
I have thought through issues of accountability and transparency. Your question was the size of my press corps, I think.
No, sir, it was not. My question was access of the media and the public to the work of the Secretary of State.
We want to ensure at all times, if confirmed, that the Secretary of State and the State Department is fully transparent with the public. That's part of my comment of being truthful and being, and holding ourselves accountable as well as others accountable.
Okay. Switching gears, and I'll get back to this in the next round of questioning. In fact, I'm going to yield back because it's a new line of questioning that I have.
Okay. I will, just as a matter of sharing some information, the supplying of lethal defensive support to Ukraine at a time when we were only sending used night vision goggles and MREs was something that was strongly supported in a bipartisan way on this committee under Chairman Menendez's leadership. I just want to say that for the record. And so I didn't view the response to be necessarily in any way outside the norms of what this committee overwhelmingly supported at that time. I'm just saying that for information. And I'm more than glad to talk more fully about that. So we're going to start the second round. They're going to be 7-minute rounds, and we're going to go in the same order that we began. If Senator Risch comes in, I would like to be able to give him time since he was around earlier and now has a conflict. And with that, I'll turn to Senator Cardin again.
Well, once again, thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, Mr. Chairman, in response to Senator Menendez's questions about lobbying in regards to the Iran Sanctions Act, just to make the record complete, I'm going to ask consent to put into the record the lobbying disclosure form from ExxonMobil Corporation that indicates that approximately $3.4 million was spent in lobbying on behalf of the Iran Sanctions Act. I'll put that into the record, Mr. Chairman, without objection. I wanted to be chairman.
For the record request.
It was for putting in some information to the record.
I understand you became chairman while I was talking, but
you got to watch it. You always got to watch out.
Without objection.
Thank you. Second thing, Mr. Tillerson, I want to just underscore a point. We talked about it in the office. This has come up several times, and that is you keep referring to the fact of your concern in regards to the Ukrainian sanctions that were imposed against Russia for their actions in Ukraine, that you were concerned that American companies could be at a disadvantage because of Europe being treated differently, the grandfather's clause, et cetera. And then we talk about leadership, and it was very true on Iran. And Senator Menendez took the leadership on this, that but for the U.S. leadership, we wouldn't have gotten other countries to act. So if we take the position we're going to the lowest common denominator, we're not going to get anything really done. And you talk about being tough and taking tough positions. It requires leadership and requires us to be willing to go the extra amount. And one last point on this, and I agree with Senator Corker. We've never had any administration believe that Congress should take away their discretion. That is absolutely fact. Whether it's a Democrat or Republican administration, they just as soon do away with Congress. We understand that. We get it. But you, I assume, understand the advantage we have in America with the separation of branches of government. And it can be helpful to you as if you're confirmed as our principal negotiator, to have clear directions from Congress that you must impose sanctions, unless you get real progress towards the issues in which those sanctions will be imposed. Take advantage of the independent branch of government. Work with us so you can have those strong tools to help America's interests. I'm going to take most of my time on this round to go over an issue that Senator Corker and I have been working through, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time going over some of the issues on tax returns, and we'll save that for a different time for our committee, because it really involves an internal debate here more so than our nominee. But as a result, I had sent to you 20 questions to answer that are related to the tax issues, because we didn't have the tax returns. And before the close of business for asking questions, I will be proposing questions to you related to your tax issues in order to better understand areas that I think we need to have information on. We are concerned about the fact, I'm concerned, I think members of the committee are concerned, that you will have some private interests. You're going to continue to operate a farm, you're going to have a charitable foundation, you have a real estate firm, a real estate partnership. We need to know a little bit more how that operates from the person who's going to be Secretary of State. You have trusts that are being set up and how those payments are paid out over time. We need to have better understanding how that operates during your term if you're confirmed as Secretary of State. So that type of information is useful to us. I'm still trying to figure out exactly how this trust that you're taking restricted stock and, if confirmed, selling it to become, or they're putting cash in rather than the restricted stock, but then you are able to withdraw the funds from the trust in the same schedule as, I believe, as the restricted stock would have become actionable. But as a result of that, you're also putting contingencies on your receipts so you can defer the taxes, or at least, as I understand, defer taxes for a significant period of time. These are issues that I think we have to have more transparency on, because they're big dollars. $180 million of understanding restricted stock. The tax consequences are about $70 million. And these are not types of tools that can be used by average Americans. So I think we need to know more about those types of issues. We also have concern about making sure that all of your employees have been properly documented and taxes paid. That's a standard issue that's been raised now in confirmation hearings. And Senator Corker and I may not think it's relevant to the final confirmations. I shouldn't say relevant, determinative to a final confirmation, but it's certainly relevant for us to have that information before we make those answers. So Mr. Tillerson, I'm going to ask you to answer these questions for the record. I hope we'll be able to get the cooperation in a timely way so that the committee can have this information before we're called upon to act on your nomination. You can respond.
I'm happy to try to answer the areas of concern you have, and I indicated that in the original questionnaire, that it's my objective to address concerns you have. You know, I'm also, though, mindful of privacy issues that are afforded to every American and the privacy issues that are afforded under individuals' tax returns. So I will do my best to answer the questions that you have, but I hope you'll also respect the privacy of myself and my family and the longstanding tradition of the privacy of individuals' tax returns.
And I can assure you that will absolutely be observed. As I had explained to Senator Corker, much of this information is not even reviewed by members. It's strictly by people who can tell us whether we have a problem or not. So I absolutely respect what you're saying, and my full intentions are to fully maintain your legitimate rights of privacy. I look forward to following up on that, and I thank you for your reply.
Thank you. Just for the edification of the committee, I think that it's true that over the last 4 years, I have worked as the lead Republican on foreign relations to ensure that we move candidates out as quickly as possible, nominees. I think at every nominations meeting we've had, that's been stated. And what I've shared with the ranking member is we have a tradition here that we are following. This has not been a committee that has asked for tax returns. It's asked for a disclosure form. And just because we were so overwhelmingly helpful with a Democratic president's nominees doesn't mean that we want to be changing the standards or unhelpful, if you will, under a Republican nominee. So I just have tried to keep things exactly the same, exactly the same. Disclosures are exactly the same. And, you know, as far as getting into, I've told Senator Cardin that if there is a substantial issue that we need to look at that would affect Senator Tillerson's, excuse me, you don't want to be demoted to that, the nominee Tillerson's role, then I'm more than glad to look much deeper into it, and if we need to have somebody from the outside do so. But to get into silly gotcha questions, not that you've done that, that's just not what we've done in this committee, and I hope we will not turn this process into one that turns qualified people away from wanting to serve. So again, if there's some substantive issue that we need to pursue and we need to get into some private setting and have someone come in from an accounting firm that really matters as it relates to his ability to not have conflicts as a Secretary of State or something like that, I'm willing to look at it as I know he is. Asking questions that, you know, are not in any way determinative in that manner, to me, is belittling the committee and certainly a huge change in the protocol and the respect with which we've dealt with nominees and their privacy in the past. So I thank you, but I thank you for working with me.
If you would just yield for one moment, I thank you for that. And I can assure you, the disagreement on supplying tax returns has nothing to do with Mr. Tillerson. It is a discussion we are having, and it has not at all delayed any of our operations, and I fully expect that I will continue to use whatever means I can to change our committee practices so that we do have our nominees, as many other committees in the Senate require, to file tax returns. That's not unique. Small business, I've been told by Senator Shaheen, requires but the second point I would just make very quickly is that the second point, the ability of members to ask questions for the record and they ask questions of the nominee has pretty well been respected. And I would hope that that right would not be diminished, that we have the ability to ask questions for the witnesses in regards to areas that we think are important.
No one in any way is trying to diminish that. I know that you and I have agreed on a series of questions that will come from the committee itself, and Mr. Tillerson, as I understand it, is going to answer those. I would think that absolutely the arrangement that he has with Exxon is something that should be fully vetted, and everyone here understands that that is going to happen, and he's going to make that all forth, and has actually. I would just say, again, we may wish to change our standards for 4 years from now. Our most recent Secretary of State, as I understand it, as a couple was worth over $1 billion. Had all kinds of far-ranging investments. And as a committee, we never tried to force a tax return issue. They filled out the disclosures, and we as a committee asked them questions. Same thing happened with Secretary Clinton. So all I'm trying to do is not in any way change the way that we operate because of the outcome of an election, and continue to be, again, that island of bipartisanship where we continue to operate regardless of who wins an election in the same manner. I'm in no way trying to infer that you're attempting to do that. I'm just telling you what I'm attempting to do. And with that, if we can close this matter out, I'll turn to Senator Rubio.
Thank you. Mr. Tillerson, when we met on Monday night, and thank you for coming by, I provided you a copy of a bill that was filed in the last Congress, which I anticipate has or will be filed again in this new Congress here in the Senate by my colleagues, Senator Flake and Senator Leahy. What it would do is it would remove the travel ban to Cuba by Americans. If you are confirmed and that bill were to pass the Congress, would you advise, can you commit that you would advise the President to veto that bill?
Senator, as to the current status of travel to Cuba, that is going to be under discussion with the President-elect. I think he's been fairly clear on his intent that he is going to ask all agencies, essentially on day one, to do a complete review of recent executive orders and the change of the status of travel to Cuba as well as business activities in Cuba. So it would be my expectation that the President would not immediately approve that bill until after that review had occurred, because that would be part of a broader view of our posture towards Cuba.
Well, again, if he doesn't act on the bill, it would become law without his signature. So my question is, at this time, you cannot commit to supporting a veto of that bill should it pass.
Well, I would support a veto because I don't think we want to change the current status of things until we've completed that review.
That was the question I wanted to get to. Let me ask you this. If a bill were to pass Congress that would remove the U.S. embargo against Cuba, and there hasn't been democratic changes on the island of Cuba, would you advise the President to veto a bill that lifted the embargo on Cuba?
If confirmed, yes, I would.
And can you also commit that you would advise the President to reverse many, if not all, of the Obama administration's Cuba regulations and executive orders regarding Cuba that were recently submitted in 2014?
As indicated, I expect a comprehensive review of all those executive orders, and from the State Department perspective, would want to examine carefully the criteria under which Cuba was delisted from the list of terrorist nations that support terrorism, and whether or not that delisting was appropriate and whether or not the circumstances which led to that delisting still exist.
You do not currently have an opinion at this time as to whether Cuba belongs on the list of terror sponsors?
Well, I would need to examine all the criteria that were used to make the current determination, and then utilizing the expertise of those in the State Department, again informed by the interagency process, to look at those criteria that would put Cuba back on that list.
As I'm sure you're aware, there is a dispute between China and Japan over control of the Senkaku island chain. If China attempted to take over the island chain through the use of military force, would you support the United States responding with military force to prevent that from happening?
Well, we have longstanding ally commitments with Japan and South Korea in the area, and I think we would respond in accordance with those accords, which are not a NATO-type agreement, but certainly we have made commitments to Japan in terms of a guarantee of their defense.
I want to, because in your opening remarks you referred to human rights, and I'm glad that you did, and I wanted to walk you through a few examples quickly. I shared with you when we met on Monday a political prisoner database maintained by the Congressional Executive Commission on China. It contains more than 1,400 active records of individuals known or believed to be in detention. Do you believe China is one of the world's worst human rights violators?
China has serious human rights violations relative to categorizing it against other nations. I would have to have more information, but they certainly have serious human rights violations.
Okay. Well, since President Rodrigo Duterte took office last June, the Los Angeles Times reports that roughly over 6,200 people have been killed in the Philippines by police and vigilantes in alleged drug raids. In your view, is this the right way to conduct an anti-drug campaign?
Senator, the U.S., America, and the people of the Philippines have a long-standing friendship, and I think it's important that we keep that in perspective in engaging with the government of the Philippines, that long-standing friendship, and they have been an ally, and we need to ensure that they stay an ally.
That's correct, Mr. Tillerson, but my question is about the 6,200 people that have been killed in these alleged drug raids. Do you believe that that is an appropriate way to conduct that operation, or do you believe that it is something that's conducive to human rights violations that we should be concerned about and condemning?
Senator, have confirmed, again, it's an area that I'd want to understand in greater detail in terms of the facts on the ground. I'm not disputing anything you're saying, because I know you have access to information that I do not have.
This is from the Los Angeles Times.
Well, again, I'm not going to rely on solely what I read in the newspapers. I will go to the facts on the ground. I'm sure there's good, credible information available through our various government agencies.
Well, one of the sources for that number in the campaign and its nature is President Duterte himself, who openly brags about the people that are being shot and killed in the streets, who he has determined are drug dealers without any trial. So if in fact he continues to brag about it, would that be reliable information that you would look at and say, okay, it's happening? I mean, what's happening in the Philippines is not an intelligence issue. It is openly reported in multiple press accounts. The president-elect has spoken about it, and quite frankly, the president of the Philippines has admitted to it, in fact, brags about it. So I guess my question is that, in your opinion, an appropriate way for him to act, and should it influence our relationship with the Philippines?
If the facts are in fact supportive of those numbers and those actions, then I don't think any of us would accept that as a proper way to deal with offenders, no matter how egregious the offenders may be.
I'm sure you're also aware of the lack of both religious freedoms and the rights and lack of rights of women in Saudi Arabia. In your opinion, is Saudi Arabia a human rights violator?
Saudi Arabia certainly does not share the same values of America. However, American interests have been advocating in Saudi Arabia for some time. And I think the question is, what is the pace of progress that should be expected for the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia to advance rights to women and others in the country?
But as it currently stands, do you consider what they're doing to be human rights violations?
I would need to have greater information, Senator, in order to make a true determination of that.
You're not familiar with the state of affairs for people in Saudi Arabia, what life is like for women? They can't drive. We've
Yes.
had people jailed and lashed. You are familiar with all of that?
Yes, Senator, I'm familiar with all of that. And
So what more information would you need?
in terms of when you designate someone or label someone, the question is that the most effective way to have progress continue to be made in Saudi Arabia or any other country? And so my interest is the same as yours. Our interests are not different, Senator, and there seems to be some misunderstanding that somehow I see the world through a different lens, and I do not. I share all the same values that you share and want the same things for people the world over in terms of freedoms. But I'm also clear-eyed and realistic about dealing in cultures. These are centuries-long cultures, cultural differences. It doesn't mean that we can't affect them and affect them to change. And in fact, over the many, many years that I've been traveling to the kingdom, while the pace has been slower than any of us wish, there is a change underway in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. How and if they ever arrive to the same value system we have, I can't predict that. But what I do believe is it is moving in the direction that we want it to move. And what I wouldn't want to do is to take some kind of a precipitous action that suddenly causes the leadership in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia to have to interrupt that. I'd like for them to continue to make that progress.
Thank you. Senator Menendez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Tillerson, I know that you're new to this, and I know that the chairman was trying to help you out on the question of lobbying on sanctions. You stated on the record that, to your knowledge, neither you nor Exxon ever lobbied against sanctions, that you were merely seeking information. I have 4 different lobbying reports totaling millions of dollars, as required by the Lobbying Disclosure Act, that lists ExxonMobil's lobbying activities on 4 specific pieces of legislation authorizing sanctions, including the Comprehensive Iran Sanctions Accountability and Divestment Act of 2010, the Russian Aggression Prevention Act of 2014, the Ukraine Freedom Support Act of 2014, and the Stand for Ukraine Act. Now, I know you're new to this, but it's pretty clear. My understanding is that when you employ lobbyists who submit lobbying forms under the law, you are taking a position. Is that not correct?
If the form clearly indicates whether we were, I don't know, I haven't seen the form you're holding in your hand, so I don't know whether it indicates were we lobbying for the sanctions or were we lobbying against the sanctions.
I know you weren't lobbying for the sanctions, but
well, if the form
it says specifically, for example, here, specific lobbying issues, Russian aggression prevention of 2014, provisions related to energy. You weren't lobbying for sanctions on energy, were you?
I think that's a description of the subject that was discussed. And I haven't seen the form, Senator, so I don't want to be presumptuous.
Well, you don't. Here. Let me just edify you for the future. You don't need a lobbying disclosure form to simply seek information and clarification about a bill. That's not lobbying. Lobbying specifically is to promote a view, a position, and whatnot. So that's, I'd ask unanimous consent to have these included in the record. So there was lobbying here. And I know that Senator Booker asked you about USA Engage, which you said you don't know about, but ExxonMobil is listed on USA Engage, whose whole purpose, and I'm sure that while Exxon is a huge corporation, like the State Department is a very big entity, that you may not know every minutia of what's going on, but you have to generally understand that you're giving direction as to whether or not you want to be lobbying on certain issues or not, you want to be taking positions on certain issues or not. And so just like you told me earlier that in your world conversation with the President-elect, you didn't discuss Russia, it's a little difficult to think you actually don't know that Exxon was lobbying on these issues of sanctions.
My understanding is those reports are required whether you're lobbying for something or you're lobbying against something. You're still required to report that you have lobbying activity.
So you believe you were paying monies to lobby for sanctions?
I don't know. All I know, Senator, is I don't
Could you
recall.
imagine being in a position in which you would have your company and its shareholders pay money to lobby for sanctions that would affect your bottom line?
I don't know, Senator. It would depend on the circumstance.
All right, let me turn to Mexico, a little different part of the world than we've been discussing. Some of us care about the Western Hemisphere. Last week, the President-elect tweeted that any money spent on building the Great Wall will be paid by Mexico. Mr. Tillerson building a wall on the southern border and having Mexico pay for it has been a hallmark chant at Trump rallies. Now the President-elect says the American people will pay for it and then that the Mexicans will reimburse us. I also want to point out that the last time a country tried to wall itself completely from its neighbor was in Berlin in 1961, and that wall was constructed by communist East Germany. Former Mexican president last week tweeted, and it seems that somehow we are conducting foreign policy by tweets these days, that Trump may ask whoever he wants, but still neither myself nor Mexico are going to pay for his racist monument, another promise he can't keep, close quotes. As you're well aware, the President-elect has repeatedly referred to Mexican citizens who have come to the United States as saying they're sending, quote, people that have lots of problems, and they're bringing those problems with us. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people. So, Mr. Tillerson, do you think Mexicans are criminals, drug dealers, and rapists?
I would never characterize an entire population of people with any single term at all.
Do you think that those comments help our relationship with Mexico, our third largest trading partner, a trading partner that represents $583 billion in trades of goods and services, including our second largest goods export market?
Mexico is a longstanding neighbor and friend of this country.
And so that doesn't help your job as the Secretary of State, does it, if you are to achieve nomination?
Well, we're going to engage with Mexico because of their importance to us in this hemisphere, and we have many, many common issues, common areas of concern.
Let me turn to another part of the Western Hemisphere. Senator Rubio referred to it, so he took care of some of the things I cared about. When you and I met, you indicated to me on Cuba that you needed more time, which is fair, to come to a conclusion about your opinion on U.S.-Cuba policy and the Obama administration changes. I want to share with you the latest report by, it's not me, okay, by Amnesty International, that noted, quote, despite increasingly open diplomatic relations, severe restrictions on freedoms of expression, association, and movement continued. Thousands of cases of harassment of government critics and arbitrary arrests and detentions were reported. Thousands, that's their quote. The Cuban Commission for Human Rights and National Reconciliation, which works within Cuba, documented more than 8,600 politically motivated detentions of government opponents and activists during the year. There's a group of women who march every Sunday to church with gladiolas. They're called the Women in White. They get beaten savagely simply because of their peaceful protests. Now, I would hope that you would agree with me that if our engagement is still going to allow that to take place, then something's wrong with our engagement. Something fell short. And I have a specific question on Cuba. Do you think that as a condition of establishing diplomatic relations with Cuba, we at a minimum should have insisted on the return of fugitives, cop killers, like New Jersey cop killer Joanne Chesimard and other American fugitives of justice being harbored by the Castro regime?
I do, Senator.
Thank you very much. Now, would you finally commit yourself, if you are confirmed the Secretary of State to work with us and others, New Mexico, others, have cop killers that are in, and other fugitives that are in Cuba, to make that conditioning of any future transactions as it relates to Cuba.
Senator, if confirmed, I look forward to working with you most specifically, as well as Senator Rubio and others who I know have a great depth of knowledge on Cuba, to ensure that we are not relaxing the pressure on Cuba to reform its oppressive regime. And certainly, as I indicated in response to a question earlier and in my opening remarks, the Cuban leadership got a lot out of the most recent deal. We need to make no mistake about where the flows of funds are going inside of Cuba. And the Cuban people got almost nothing. And as I indicated, the President-elect, I think, has been very clear on his intent to direct a bottoms-up review of the entire relationship with Cuba.
Thank you.
I appreciate the great senator from New Jersey acknowledging that when our nominee has left an impression that I don't think he is wishing to leave, that I give him an opportunity to change that. Thank you. And with that, Senator Risch.
Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Senator Risch has got a 10-minute segment because he missed the first round. Thank you for being here.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I won't take that full 10 minutes. Mr. Tillerson, thank you for your willingness to do this. You're going to be hitting the ground at a very difficult time as far as U.S. relationships around the world. They've spiraled out of control from time to time, and we are not in a good place in many parts of the world, primarily because of U.S. policy. And it's going to be rethought, it's going to be redeveloped, and I thank you for willingness to take that on. I was struck when you were named that this is something that's been a bit off of the radar screen of most Americans, and that is the importance of the work that the State Department does in dealing with our companies and with commerce in foreign countries. Most Americans don't realize how difficult it is to do business overseas, and the State Department really needs to focus on that more than what they have, and be helpful to countries that do want to do business overseas, because it is, a lot of times it has to go through government sources to get into business over there. So I was impressed with that, and I'm glad having your business background that you do. I think you're going to be very helpful in that regard, and helping the State Department further understand its responsibilities in that regard. And the State Department does a good job. Every one of us have traveled overseas, sometimes in bipartisan fashion, isn't that right, Senator Shaheen? We're always treated, regardless of the political party, so well by our people, State Department people that are working there. We've talked a lot. Russia's got a lot of play in this meeting, but we haven't talked much about Iran and North Korea. Those are a couple of real challenges for us, and those policies, as far as those two countries are concerned, really need to be rethought and recalibrated, and then re-announced in a way that they understand what America's going to do, where we're coming from, and what we're going to do. I think in talking with people, our allies, they're confused as to where we want to go with this and what we're going to do and how we're going to do it. And the same is true with ISIS, how we're going to handle that situation, where they're operating both in Iraq and Syria. So I'm not going to press you on those, because you are just getting your feet on the ground, and I hope the President-elect will be, after you're able to get your arms around these things, he'll listen to you carefully as to the policies we're going to develop for that. The policies need to be entirely different than what they are. In that part of the world, the sipping tea and singing Kumbaya is not a way that you're going to be successful in a lot of those countries. They understand strength, not necessarily the use of strength, but they understand people who possess strength and people who they are convinced will use that strength if necessary. They need to be convinced of that. And I know there's a lot of people complaining about the relationship between Mr. Putin and the President-elect, and for that matter, yourself and Mr. Putin. I hope Mr. Putin gets to know both of you guys really, really well, because I think he'll be convinced that you do project American strength, and that America still has the muscle that it's had, and that we still stand for what we stand for, and we're going to project that around the world. So in that regard, I really hope that Mr. Putin does have a relationship to where he gets to know both of you guys, and especially the president-elect, because I think that will impress him, that he's not going to be able to get away with the kind of stuff that he's gotten away with in the Crimea, or in Syria, or in other places where they've been meddling in the world where they shouldn't be. So finally, let me say again, thank you for your willingness to do this. I've been impressed as we've been sitting here. The meeting we had in my office was very good. We were able to develop a lot of these thoughts a lot more deeply than we can here. I want to say that I've been really impressed, having come from a private sector background myself. It's difficult for people to understand that the transition from the private sector and business into the world of diplomacy is very different. It's a transition that needs to be made. And just sitting here listening to you over the hours that you have been here, I've been very impressed that you've been able to make that transition. You're speaking in terms that diplomats understand. I appreciate that. I think it'll serve you well as you go forward. So again, thank you for your willingness to do this. And with that, I'll yield back time, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. This was the last person of the first round, so we're going to get back into the sink we were in before. Senator Johnson.
Hey, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Tillerson, I want to go back to the 4 responsibilities that Secretary Gates laid out for the Secretary of State: advise the President, negotiate agreements, represent us abroad, and lead the State Department. Represent U.S. abroad. I met you the morning I returned from my trip to Israel, which was a couple days before the way I would term it, the U.S.'s shameful abstention in that vote on settlements. I've never understood why any administration, we've done this on a bipartisan fashion, would force a friend, an ally, to sit down and negotiate with, I guess, negotiating partners that refuse to acknowledge the right to exist. I mean, that's kind of table stakes, right? It's kind of, in business, it's sitting down and forcing negotiation to buy a company somebody doesn't want to sell it. Do you have a similar type of view on that? I appreciate the fact that, and I agree with you, that I think that actually complicates the future negotiation on that.
Well, I do have a view on it, Senator, and thank you. It would be akin, in many respects, if you're negotiating with someone that denies your right to exist, you'd have to question, well, why would they ever live up to an agreement if they don't expect you to be around? So it is already a complex negotiation, and then to force one party to the table through coercion or however you want to describe the most recent resolution is not useful. There have been many opportunities since the Oslo Accord for parties to sit down and try to work things out. The leadership certainly has not seized those opportunities. I would say in the case of the Palestinian leadership, while they have renounced violence, it's one thing to renounce it, and it's another to take concrete action to prevent it. And I think until there is a serious demonstration on their part that they are willing to do more than just renounce the violence, they're willing to do something to at least interrupt it or interfere with it, it's going to be very difficult to create conditions at the table for parties to have any productive discussion around settlement.
Do you agree that Israel has conceded just about every point, and it's, at this point in time, Palestinians just refuse to say yes?
Well, I think there have been many, many opportunities again for progress to be made, and those have never been seized upon. So I do think it is a matter to be discussed and decided between the two parties. To the extent America's foreign policy engagement can create a more fruitful environment for those discussions, then I think that's the role we can play. But at the end of it, this has to be settled between these two parties.
Our policy should be to help strengthen our friends. In terms of negotiating agreements, advising the President, I think Congress has willingly given away its advice consent power. Most famously recently is the Iranian agreement. You look at the the Foreign Affairs Manual, I think clearly that Iranian agreement was a treaty. And I think Had we honestly upheld our oath of office, that vote on my amendment deemed that a treaty should have been 100-1. Every senator should have voted to support and defend the Constitution, which first starts with jealously guarding our power, advice, and consent. Would you advise, first of all, do you believe that was a treaty?
It would have all the appearances of a treaty. It looks like a treaty.
What about the Paris Climate Accord, which commits us to a fair amount of expenditure? Do you believe that's a treaty, or just an agreement that the executive can enter in on its own?
It looks like a treaty.
Will you work with us then, will you advise the President, as you go negotiate for this nation, to respect the Constitution and come to Congress, come to the Senate for advice and consent on treaties?
Senator, I respect the proper roles of both branches of government. In my conversations with the President-elect, he does as well. And I think he's expressed some of these same views that under the past administration, the executive branch has gone pretty far out there in terms of recognizing the proper role of Congress as a body to express its own view on some of these agreements.
Leading the State Department, you obviously were the CEO of a functioning, a successful organization, 75,000 employees, I think the number was. But they're employees that have the same mission statement. They understand their roles to achieve the goals. They're actually supportive of the goals of the organization. You're going to be assuming the leadership of a department that, I mean, let's face it, in many cases you have entrenched bureaucrats that are not only don't necessarily agree with your foreign policy or the next administration's foreign policy, might be hostile to it. Do you understand that challenge? And as an experienced manager, how are you going to react to that? How are you going to deal with that?
You're right, Senator. The State Department had a little over 70,000 employees, interestingly about the same size of the organization that I led when I was at ExxonMobil. About more than 40,000 of those State Department employees are deployed overseas. Interestingly, about 60% of ExxonMobil's employees are not Americans. So in terms of understanding and dealing with people who are representing you around the world, and they're halfway around the world in various embassies and missions, how do you get all of these people aligned with one objective? And the objective is America's interest and America's national security. So I think part of leadership is expressing very clear views, and then part of leadership is having an organization that has clear line of sight on issues as to who owns these and who's going to be held accountable for them, and having an organization that is all working in concert toward that objective. My experience has been that people look for leadership, and when they're acting in ways that are contrary to the overall mission, it's generally because there's been an absence of strong leadership to clearly define to them what that expectation is and what their role in it is, and then reward people who are behaving in a way that supports the overall mission and not support their own agenda. I've used a term many times in large organizations of working in the general interest. Well, the general interest of the State Department is the American people's interest. And if anyone's working in a way that's only to advance their own interest, they're not working in the general interest. And I think it's important that people understand that is the responsibility of all of us who will serve the country in the State Department, is the general interest, which is the American people's interest.
Thank you, Mr. Tillerson. Good luck in your next assignment.
Thank you. Senator Shaheen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'm glad you came back after lunch, Mr. Tillerson. I appreciated very much your response to that question, because I have to say my experience with State Department employees is that the overwhelming majority of them are dedicated. They're dedicated to this country. They do their work often at great personal sacrifice, and I think we should appreciate the work that they do. And it sounds to me like you share that appreciation for the sacrifices that they make.
I most certainly do, Senator. I have a great affection for those who are willing to take these overseas assignments. Many of them are in very difficult locations, and particularly when their families go with them, they truly are sacrificing on behalf of this country, and I think that they deserve the recognition for that and the appreciation for it.
Well, thank you. There's been some discussion today about the concerns that this committee has expressed about, which I think are legitimate, about potential conflicts of interest that you might face if confirmed as Secretary of State because of your long career at Exxon. And while I understand there are some concerns about the precise approach that you've taken to divest your financial interests in Exxon, I do appreciate that you have taken these concrete actions and that you plan to take more if you are confirmed. And I wonder if you could talk about why you think that's important.
Well, Senator, and again, as I commented in response to a question earlier, I had a great 41-and-a-half-year career. I was truly blessed, enjoyed every minute of it. That part of my life's over. I've been humbled and honored with the opportunity to now serve my country. Never thought I would have an opportunity to serve in this way. And so when I made the decision to say yes to President-elect Trump when he asked me to do this, the first step I took was to retain my own outside counsel to begin the process, and the only guidance I gave them is I must have a complete and clear, clean break from all of my connections to ExxonMobil, not even the appearance. And whatever's required for us to achieve that, get that in place. I am appreciative that the ExxonMobil Corporation, who were represented by their own counsel, and the ExxonMobil board were willing to work with me to achieve that as well. It was their objective too. And in the end, if that required me to walk away from some things, that's fine. Whatever was necessary to achieve that. And again, told people I don't even want the appearance that there's any connection to myself and the future fortunes, up or down, of the ExxonMobil Corporation.
Well, again, thank you very much for that. I'm sad to say that I think it stands in stark contrast to what we heard from President-elect Trump today, who announced that he is not going to divest himself of his vast business interests around the world. So I do appreciate your recognition that this is important for maintaining the integrity of the position with the American public and the world. You talked about eliminating ISIS as one of your top priorities if you're confirmed. And your opening statement connects radical Islam to ISIS. And you also make the point of saying that you think it's important to support Muslims around the world who reject radical Islam. During the last Congress, this committee heard about the importance of working with the Muslim community in the United States to combat ISIS and the domestic terrorists that have been produced as the result of ISIS ideology. In your view, is it helpful to suggest that as Americans we should be afraid of Muslims?
No, Senator. In my travels and because of my past work, I've traveled extensively in Muslim countries, not just the Middle East, but throughout Southeast Asia, and have gained an appreciation and recognition of this great faith. And that's why I made a distinction that we should support those Muslim voices that reject this same radical Islam that we reject. This is part of winning the war other than on the battlefield. I mentioned we have to win it not just on the battlefield. We've got to win the war of ideas, and one of our greatest allies in this war is going to be the moderate voices of people of the Muslim faith who speak from their perspective and their rejection of that representation of what is otherwise a great faith.
And so do you support restricting travel or immigration to the United States by Muslims?
I think what's important is that we are able to make a judgment about the people that are coming into the country. And so, no, I do not support a blanket type rejection of any particular group of people. But clearly, we have serious challenges to be able to vet people coming into the country, and particularly under the current circumstances because of the instability in the parts of the world that it's occurring and the massive migration that's occurred out of the region. And a lack of any documentation following people as they have moved through various other countries. It's a huge challenge, and I don't think we can just close our eyes and ignore that. We have to be very clear-eyed about recognizing that threat and developing a means to deal with it.
Well, I certainly agree with that, which is very different, I think, than a ban on an entire religion, people of that religion. Do you support creating a national registry for American Muslims?
I would need to have a lot more information around how such an approach would even be constructed. And if it were a tool for vetting, then it probably extends to other people as well, other groups that are threats to the U.S. But it would just require me much more information around how that would even be approached.
And one of the things you and I discussed when we met was the special immigrant visa program that we have maintained for Afghans who have helped our men and women in the military on the ground. And will you support continuing that program to ensure that those people who have been properly vetted, who helped our men and women, are able to come to this country when their lives are threatened in Afghanistan?
Special visa waiver, it's important that we protect those whose lives are truly at risk because of their efforts to assist our American military forces or other forces in Afghanistan. I think it is also important to make the distinction, otherwise we undermine this program and risk losing it, and not expand it to allow other people to come through the program that are not truly at risk. And so I think it's the execution, and this gets back to following through on what the intent of these programs were, and let's be very specific and execute well and not get sloppy in the execution and start having a lot of other folks coming through the program that really don't meet that criteria.
Well, thank you. I think Congress has pretty narrowly focused the program. I appreciate that.
Thank you. And I do want to say I appreciate the fact that you were able to highlight that, the Secretary of State shares his views, ultimately has to carry out the policies of the president or he's not successful. But I think it's good to distinguish that sometimes people have very different views and they lobby strongly for those views, and that's what we're wanting to hear from, is what Mr. Tillerson's views are on these issues and how he will attempt to persuade the administration. He may not be successful, but I thank you for highlighting that just now. Senator Gardner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Tillerson, thank you again for your continued patience and participation in this very important discussion. I would follow up with many of the discussions today on human rights issues. I just was notified that the administration has sanctioned 2 additional individuals in North Korea under the legislation that we passed this past year, North Korea Sanctions Act. The younger sister of Kim Jong-un was sanctioned for human rights violations, as well as the Minister of State Security in North Korea. I think it's important that we continue, and I appreciate your commitment that you gave me in the prior round of questioning about your commitment to the mandatory sanctioning of people who carry out human rights violations. It's something that we can do together. It's something the administration and Congress should work together to make sure that we're trying to protect people from tyrants around the globe who would murder their own people. Mr. Tillerson, you mentioned Southeast Asia in your last answer to Senator Shaheen. China has been actively reclaiming, building islands in the South China Sea, 3,000 acres of land since reclamation activities commenced in 2013. Reports and open source information that they have militarized some of these reclamation areas. We authored legislation last year, a resolution that called for the Obama administration to take a very stronger and much more aggressive approach to these activities in the South China Sea, including additional and more frequent freedom of navigation operations, overflights of the South China Sea. In July, The Hague, the International Tribunal, ruled against China, held that they violated Philippines' sovereignty. What do you believe the position of the United States ought to be in the South China Sea, and what more could we be doing to stop China from violating international law?
Well, I think when it comes to China, and you mentioned North Korea previous to this, that we've really got to take what I would call a whole of China government approach. I think part of where we've struggled with China is, and I mentioned in my opening remarks, we do have important economic relationships. I said our economies are intertwined. But we've got to step back and look at all of China's activities. And the one you mentioned now, the island building in the South China Sea, the declaration of control of airspace in waters over the Senkaku Islands with Japan. Both of those are illegal actions. They're taking territory or control or declaring control of territories that are not rightfully China's. The island building in the South China Sea itself, in many respects, in my view, building islands and then putting military assets on those islands is akin to Russia's taking of Crimea. It's taking of territory that others lay claim to. The U.S. has never taken a side in the issues, but what we have advocated for is, look, that's a disputed area. There are international processes for dealing with that, and China should respect those international processes. As you mentioned, some of their actions have already been challenged at the courts in The Hague, and they were found to be in violation. So it is, China's activity in this area is extremely worrisome, and I think, again, a failure of a response has allowed them just to keep pushing the envelope on this. So again, we find we are where we are, and we just have to deal with it. And the way we've got to deal with it is we've got to show back up in the region with our traditional allies in Southeast Asia, and I think use some existing structures to begin the re-engagement. Use ASEAN, of which most of the members of ASEAN are affected by this. You've got $5 trillion of economic trade goes through those waters every day, and this is a threat to the entire global economy if China is allowed to somehow dictate the terms of passage through these waters. So this is a global issue of great importance to many, many of our important allies, but certainly to people in the region.
And you would support a more aggressive posture in South China Sea?
We're going to have to send China a clear signal that first, the island building stops, and second, your access to those islands is also not going to be allowed.
Thank you, Mr. Tillerson. Last year, I passed legislation that would encourage Taiwan's entry into the international police organization, Interpol. It was signed into law by the President. The President has made it clear that Taiwan is our friend, and last Sunday, mainland Chinese, as a result of some of President-elect Trump's activities and actions, the state-run newspaper, the Global Times, said the following, quote, "If Trump reneges on the one China policy after taking office, the Chinese people will demand the government to take revenge. There is no room for bargaining." The editorial also went on to say that they should also impose military pressure on Taiwan and push it to the edge of being reunified by force. Combined with the PRC's recent show of forces exercises around Taiwan, it appears that Beijing has increased its pressure considerably on Taiwan. Can you share with this committee the Trump administration's position on Taiwan and its position on the one China policy?
Well, I think with respect to Taiwan, we've made important commitments to Taiwan through the Taiwan Relations Act, through the 6 Issues Accord, and I think we should express a reaffirmation of those. Again, this is part of this approach that I'm trying to lay out over and over, that we've made commitments to people. We need to reaffirm those commitments and live up to those commitments. And I think it's important that Taiwan know that we are going to live up to the commitments under the Relations Act and the 6 Issues Accord. That in and of itself is a message. So I think the importance of that action to, again, this whole of China approach that I'm speaking about is we've got to deal with the whole of China's actions and recognize that we have these balancing forces in our relationship that need to be dealt with.
In terms of one China policy, the new administration's position?
I don't know of any plans to alter the one China position.
Thank you. And an issue back in Colorado that I think is very important. It's coming to attention of a lot of people around the country as they hear from NGOs. Compassion International, faith-based group in Colorado, serves nearly 2 million children living in extreme poverty around the world. They've operated in Colorado since, Compassion's operated in India since 1968. They've contributed nearly $50 million in aid to India. They've provided one-to-one scholarships for 145,000 Indian children. But since 2014, Compassion has been the target of multiple coordinated governmental attacks because of its unapologetically Christian belief, but it's been delivering humanitarian services to hundreds of thousands of Indian children. But due to the restrictions by the Indian government, they've been unable to fund its India operations since February of 2016, despite having broken no laws. I believe the State Department should take notice that this ill treatment of Compassion International should stop. It's part of a broader pattern by the government of India, where other NGOs have seen similar problems. The State Department should insist the Indian government release Compassion funds, restore its FCRA licenses, and permit Compassion to immediately resume its humanitarian operations. And we just appreciate your assistance on that. This is a pattern that's very disturbing as an organization does nothing more than try to help children in poverty.
Well, Senator, I appreciate you bringing it to my attention and look forward, if I'm confirmed, to discussing it further with you.
I also appreciate you bringing it up. I know Chairman Royce very concerned about this issue, and I know he'll be thankful that you brought it to everyone's attention here today. Thank you. Senator Udall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Tillerson, in your capacity as CEO of ExxonMobil, you praised the Paris Agreement last year, noting that addressing climate change, and I quote, requires broad-based practical solutions around the world. Do you personally believe that the overall national interests of the United States are better served by staying in the Paris Agreement? If so, why? And if not, why not?
As I indicated earlier in a response, I think having a seat at the table to address this issue on a global basis, and it is important that I think it's 190 countries or thereabouts have signed on to begin to take action. I think we're better served by being at that table than leaving that table.
And I think you understand that it's been a generation or more that it's taken to get all the countries at the table to sign an agreement, be willing to move forward with targets, and it would be very unfortunate, I think, to move away from the table. So thank you for your answer there. I just wanted to follow up on a discussion Senator Flake had with you in the first round, urging you to look at the successes of our policy change in Cuba. And this is mainly because you, as a CEO at Exxon, I suspect that you had a low tolerance for old ideas that had failed to produce positive results. Regardless of what one thinks about the Cuban government, no one can argue that the policy of embargo and isolation has achieved any progress. The proof is right in front of us. The Castro regime endures. And I'm a strong supporter of the policy of re-engagement, which has already produced results. And, you know, you mentioned you're going to do a bottoms-up review. In thinking about that bottoms-up review, I would just point out that these things that I'm going to mention have happened and are very positive. First of all, we've worked with the Cubans to combat diseases such as Zika, diabetes, and a multinational effort to combat Ebola in Africa. Efforts to increase access to the Internet have paid off with new Wi-Fi hotspots in Havana and increased efforts to bring improved cellular access to the island, including roaming deals with U.S. carriers. Increased bilateral business activity supported by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and the Hispano Chamber of Commerce. And last week, the United States and Cuba signed a bilateral agreement to prepare for and respond to oil spills and hazardous substance pollution in the Gulf of Mexico and the Straits of Florida. Our new policy towards Cuba, according to a 2015 Pew Research poll, shows that 72% of Americans support the renewed diplomatic relations and 73% support ending the embargo. I doubt that there are many issues where such a vast majority of the American people agree, and I hope we will not be letting those Americans down by returning to a period where such efforts are made impossible by a failed policy that showed no results. Instead, I hope you will continue to work to support the Cuban small business owner, almost 500,000 licensed businesses and growing, and to continue the engagement which has led to increased opportunities for both Cuban and American businesses in Cuba. Will you recommend to President-elect Trump a policy of engagement with Cuba in order to foster the change that is needed on the island? Or do you prefer to go back to the old policy of the past 50 years that failed to bring real change or undermine the Castro regime?
Well, Senator, again, if confirmed, the job of the diplomat is to engage. And so engagement is always preferred, and our door is always open to want to engage to affect change. But I think we have to be honest with ourselves about the engagement with Cuba. There is long-standing statutes in place that govern that relationship. The Helms-Burton Amendment, the designated list of state sponsors of terrorism, and there's specific criteria around whether we and organizations and those who are conducting affairs in Cuba are in compliance with those statutory requirements. So if we are able to engage in a positive way and still meet all of the compliance of those statutes, then that's a good thing. I don't know because I've not had the opportunity to have a fulsome examination, as I said earlier, of what changed. Because there's a lot of activity that's been enabled, and obviously someone had to make a determination that something changed. Did it in fact change? I'd like to see all of the documentation, the information around that. Otherwise, if we're going to change the relationship, we've got to change those statutes as well. So I'm, again, kind of this common theme maybe you're hearing from me is I believe we live up to the agreements and we live up to the laws and we fully enforce them. They were put there for a reason. If circumstances change, then we need to change our posture on those as well. But that's the reason I think it demands a bottoms-up review, because a lot of things have been changed in the recent past here, much of it by executive order, and I think the President-elect has indicated he'd really like to understand all of that. What was the criteria that the State Department used to make its determinations? That's what he's going to be asking me.
Well, the reason I cited those polls is I think the American people are at the point of wanting those statutes to be set aside, and I quoted one, and so I don't want to argue with you, but I very much appreciate your answers in terms of consulting State Department people, and I can't think of better professionals than these State Department professionals that spend decades learning about the regions that they serve in, the specific countries they work on, and I appreciate your thoughtfulness in terms of doing that. And just a final question here is Senator Menendez mentioned the whole issue of fugitives. We also have a fugitive and by the name of Charlie Hill, who's I believe should be brought to justice. And I really believe that we have a better chance at getting him out. We're already having discussions if we engage with them rather than going back to a policy of isolation. So with that, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, sir. Senator Flake.
Thank you. We'll continue on the same theme for just a bit. I want to talk for a minute about what is it. We hear the word concession a lot, and we shouldn't make concessions to dictators or despots. Part of some of the executive orders that have been taken over the past couple of years, one of the first of which is in 2009, we found that Cuban Americans who had families still in Cuba would have to choose between going to their mother's funeral or their father's funeral if their parents died within the same 3 years. What a horrible thing to ask of an American. Do you believe that it is a concession to the regime to allow a Cuban American to visit or to go to his father or mother's funeral in Cuba?
Senator, these are really heartbreaking questions that, again, I have to take us back to what are our statutes, what are the provisions that govern that, and these are where exceptions become really difficult.
Right.
And so I want to be honest with you. When I say my expectation is, if confirmed, is to do a complete bottoms-up review of all these issues. Under what provisions are we making exceptions? What provisions allow for a waiver? Under what conditions can we grant perhaps an exception for someone
right.
to resolve these really these difficult personal issues for people,
right.
but not undermine our American values, which is the leadership of Cuba must change the way it treats its people.
Right. I don't think it was the President's executive authority to make that change. I don't think was questioned. There were certainly no lawsuits filed or any real resistance. As soon as Cuban Americans started to travel back to Cuba, it was assumed this is a great thing, and hundreds of thousands of them have remitted more money. It was illegal for them to send fish hooks to their family members on the island before. Those are some of the restrictions that were removed. I would submit that those are not concessions to a regime. It's not a concession to a regime to allow Americans to travel. Those sanctions are on Americans, not Cubans. In the same vein, with regard to diplomatic relations, we have diplomatic relations with some pretty unsavory countries, or the leadership of some countries is pretty unsavory. We have diplomatic relations with Saudi Arabia. We don't agree with how they treat women and political opponents in that country. Is it a concession to the regime to have diplomatic relations with the country?
Well, this is a question, again, that is grounded in longstanding historic policy of the United States.
Right.
And that policy and the statutes that govern that policy, if the time has come for statutes to be altered, that will be the role of Congress to alter those statutes. In the meantime, at the State Department, if I'm there and confirmed to be there, it's our role to enforce what Congress has expressed its desire. And so if the judgment of the Congress and the judgment of the State Department, the President-elect, through consultation, views that we have moved to a different place, then we should address that, but not just ignore what the law of the land is.
Right. No, I understand that completely. I'm just saying that diplomatic relations with countries is not a concession to those countries. It is in our national interest. It is the way we practice statecraft, and diplomacy is to have diplomatic relations, and I would suggest that that's the same with Cuba. As mentioned, there are fugitives from justice in Cuba that we would like back. There are fugitives from justice in a number of other countries that we'd like back as well. We use our diplomatic relations. We use statecraft and diplomacy to try to arrange those things. If we said to every country that held fugitives from justice, we're going to withhold diplomatic relations, recall our ambassadors, where would we be? And so I would suggest that a review is prudent. I'm glad that the administration is undertaking a review. I believe that a review will conclude that some of the measures that have been taken, allowing Americans to travel to Cuba, we still have restrictions. I would suggest that the restrictions that are still in place simply force Americans to place more money in the government's hands when they do travel to Cuba. Cuban Americans and other citizens of this country, that if we just lifted the travel ban completely, and they could more easily ensure that more money goes to family members and entrepreneurs on that island. So I'm glad that a review is going to take place, and I'm glad that you're going to be a part of that review. Just in a minute and a half left, you've talked a lot about sanctions. As I mentioned in the beginning, I share your aversion to sanctions, particularly when they're practiced unilaterally. What other sanctions are simply a method we have or a tool to change behavior or to induce or to punish countries. What other tools do we have without resorting to sanctions?
Well, depending on exactly what the issue is and what the target country is, certainly we have other tools related to our trade policies in general. We have tools related to our immigration and visa exchange policies in particular. In terms of the soft power side of this, obviously we always have the hard power tool to use. And so I think it does depend on the specific country, the specific issue, what our relationship has been, what are the pressure points that they're going to feel it. And that's the issue I have around ensuring that sanctions are properly structured so that we hit the proper pressure point that causes a change in the way that party's thinking or a change in the direction they're going. So it is very much case by case in terms of what we can use to apply pressure to whatever government we are wanting to alter their course.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your comments on Cuba and the multilateral sanctions issue. And I will say, you're going to find on both sides of the aisle strong divisions on the issue of Cuba. People sitting next to each other having very, very, very different views. And I do hope you'll seek input of all as you move ahead and do this top-to-bottom review. Having sat here the whole hearing, I do want to just clarify, I don't think that necessarily you've expressed an aversion to sanctions. I think what you may have expressed, if I heard correctly, is just ensuring that when they're implemented in a way that is appropriate. Is that correct?
That's correct, Senator Chairman. And as I think I commented at one point this morning, having ineffective sanctions is worse than having no sanctions at all, because it sends a weak signal to the target country, and then they say, oh, well, they're not really serious after all. And so that's why if we're going to have sanctions, they need to be carefully crafted so that they are effective.
Senator Kane.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks again, Mr. Tillerson. I want to stay in the Americas. You and I had a good discussion in my office about the Americas, and you've done work in the Americas, and also being a Texan, I think you understand the importance of the relationships. We've been grappling on this committee and in this country with unaccompanied minors coming from the Northern Triangle, and that migration from Mexico is now kind of almost at an even 0 point. But the instability in the Northern Triangle, violence, drug trade, weak civil institutions has created some challenges. We've supported in a bipartisan way investments in the Northern Triangle, but we want to make sure that the investments are, kind of targeted the right way to accomplish the objective of bringing more stability and creating more opportunity there so people don't feel a need to flee. Talk a little bit about that part of our foreign affairs portfolio, and how would you approach those issues?
Senator, I really appreciate you bringing us back to the Western Hemisphere. I know because we've talked about the hot spots, but I say that in all seriousness because I don't think we should in any way downgrade the importance of the Western Hemisphere and what's going on, not just in Central America, but South America as well. There are important relationships. There are not unimportant national security issues in this hemisphere also. But as to the immigration challenge, and I think you described it pretty well, that what's happened over the most recent time is a real shift in where these people coming across the border in an illegal fashion, where are they coming from? And they're largely transiting through Mexico, coming from south of Mexico's border. I am aware of the Northern Triangle project, which is trying to strengthen law enforcement because a lot of people are motivated to run from high crime-ridden areas, anti-narcotics trafficking, helping strengthen the governance institutions, and providing a safer environment for people down there, and to the extent we can direct assistance programs that then gets at some economic development as well, some of which is simple infrastructure projects. And some of this, again, it gets back to how to use not just this special targeted effort and the funds that have been made available there, but also how we use other aid programs like the Millennial Challenge Corporation to develop the capabilities of these countries to perform better. I do think, and I know you and I spoke about this when we were in your office, that out of our true compassion for these people that are coming across the border, many of which are unaccompanied minors, how to deal with that. And I know in response to that challenge, there's been some well-intended action taken, programs like DACA, the deferred treatment of adjudication of these cases, all well-intended, but when those got translated back to the host country, the place these people are leaving from, we know that it got misinterpreted. And even the leaders of those countries have spoken in public and indicated that, look, the wrong signals are being sent down here as a result of this effort to be compassionate. And in fact, it's incentivizing some, because it's misunderstood, to take even greater risk to themselves, to their children, to try to make this journey across Mexico, largely using illegal smugglers to get them to this country. So I think we just have to be very thoughtful about the signals we're sending, the messages we're signaling, and I think go back, as you say, go back and try to address some of the issues in the host country. Also work with Mexico, our partner right next door. Now this is a challenge for them, how to secure their southern porous border and deal with all of this transiting of their country to get to the land of the free and the home of the brave, where everybody wants to be. So I acknowledge the challenge that we have before us. We're going to have to deal with the situation that we have today, the reality of it. I think this is where the intent of the president-elect, and while he does express it in the view of the wall, but what he's really expressing is we've got to get control of this border. We've got to prevent and stop the flow of people coming across. And how we do that, what policies and how we execute those are yet to be developed. But certainly the State Department, if I confirm, will have a big role in the foreign aspects of that. Once they come across the border, they're largely the Department of Homeland Security's responsibility. The State Department's role will be what actions can we take to prevent the movement of the people in an illegal fashion. We want people to come legally. This is the history of the country is that people came here legally.
Mr. Tillerson, thank you for that. And as I said in my office, I always encourage the Secretary of State to fly north-south and not just east-west. I think there's huge opportunities in the Americas that we sometimes don't take advantage of, and other parts of the world have a claim on our attention, obviously, but there's some real opportunities. I assume you support the U.S. position that has been in place since the 1940s to do what we can, even if it's hard, to promote a two-state solution in Israel and Palestine with a Jewish state of Israel and an independent state of Palestine living peacefully side by side, that is the dream that we hope for that region, and I assume that you support that.
I don't think anyone would take a position that they don't hope for peace in that area and for the issues to be ultimately resolved.
And peace within the context of a two-state solution, as was determined by the UN and has been the bipartisan policy of the United States since the late 1940s.
I think that is the dream that everyone is in pursuit of. Whether it could ever be a reality remains to be seen.
What do you think I think this is something that has frustrated all of us, that there's been so little progress toward it in the last few years. And so what do you think, from the Secretary of State's position, you could do to try to hasten the day when we could find a path forward? People didn't think you could find a peace deal between Ireland and Northern Ireland either for hundreds of years, and yet youngsters in Ireland now don't remember when there was a problem. What might you bring to the table on that?
Well, and I'm glad you put it in the context of hundreds of years. I know that was just euphemistic, but I think it is indicative of how conflicts like this take a long time, and sometimes it takes another generation to have a changed view. Oftentimes we just have to try and make the situation as stable as possible and limit the impacts on people that are living there now. The Palestinian people have suffered a lot under their own leadership in many cases as a result of there not being more progress made. So I think it has to be a shared aspiration of all of us that ultimately is resolved. The issues are long-standing, and I think it's the State Department's role to try to create an environment that brings parties together to want to find a way forward. I can tell you under the conditions today, it's extremely challenging to do that. But that has to be the aspirational goal. And to your example, sometimes it takes a different generation that's not carrying all that baggage of the past with them.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Absolutely. Thank you. Senator Young.
Thank you. Mr. Tillerson, from the outset, I just want to thank you for the level of candor you've shown throughout this hearing. You've engaged on issues. You've answered questions. You've been adept at times, and I want that from our nation's chief diplomat. The only request I would make is that they don't coach that out of you. Should your nomination move forward and you become our next Secretary of State, which I suspect you will. So thank you for that. In your prepared statement, you write, quote, defeating ISIS must be our foremost priority in the Middle East, unquote. And you also note later that defeat will not occur on the battlefield alone. We must win the war of ideas, something we've already discussed a bit here. I couldn't agree more. We have to win the war of ideas. We can kill every single irreconcilable, as you know, who subscribes to this poisonous ideology that those who join ISIS do, and yet we're still going to have a problem. The organization will reconstitute itself, and so we really there's something deeper we need to tap into, a deeper taproot. In your prepared statement, going back to that, you indicate that if confirmed, you will ensure the State Department does its part here in this war of ideas. Now, based on your presentation for this hearing, what is your assessment of the State Department's current performance in the war of ideas? And why don't you make your comments specific to our effort against the Islamic State?
Senator, I'm not sure I could articulate what the current State Department is doing in the war on ideas, other than the advocacy, the public advocacy, condemning this type of brutality. I think your observation that even if we defeat ISIS in its caliphate in Syria and Iraq, they will morph to something else. And I think this is where we have to be truthful and realistic in our conversations with the American people. You know, terrorism has been a part of the world for centuries. It is the nature of man, the unfortunate nature of man. But what we have to do is certainly limit it and suppress it to a level that is no longer a threat to our national security or a threat, an imminent threat to Americans or all other people in the world who value human life.
So in a recent hearing before the Senate Armed Services Committee, D&I Clapper indicated that he believes the U.S. might reestablish the United States Information Agency to fight this information war and to advance our efforts to defeat, you know, radical extremists or terrorists, however one chooses to brand them. Do you agree that this would be a good idea?
Well, I think, as I indicated in the exchange with Senator Portman, we have got to up our game in terms of how we engage in both the digital communication world, because that's where ISIS has been very effective, and other radical groups, Al-Qaeda and others, have been effective in using the digital communication space to spread their message. We've got to become more effective at encountering that messaging and countering that message. But I also take Senator Portman's observation that it's not all digital. There are other communication mechanisms that are effective broad-based in terms of how do we communicate, particularly in those parts of the world that could be susceptible to these messages.
For the record, for the benefit of my colleagues and also for your benefit, I'll note that I'm just coming from the House of Representatives, and in my final 2-year term, I introduced legislation so that Congress could assess whether or not the countering violent extremism initiative within the Obama administration was working or not. Is it working? I was prepared to be briefed in a classified setting, yet the administration came out fairly strongly against our efforts to exercise oversight. So my hope would be that I can work together in a bipartisan way, and in the next administration, we will have the tools to assess whether or not we are improving and work with the administration to ensure that we are, in fact, killing the terrorists, countering violent extremism, most importantly, making sure that this effort doesn't reconstitute itself moving forward. Mr. Tillerson, back to the prepared statement. You write that China has not been a reliable partner in using its influence to curb North Korea. I know we've discussed this before, slightly different tack here. Just an open-ended question here. Why do you believe China has not done more?
Well, I'm aware that under the most recent version, I believe, of the UN sanctions, which have been ratcheted up with each of North Korea's provocative, whether it's been a nuclear test or the test firing of a missile, and I indicated earlier that China is 90% of North Korea's trading, exports, import trading. So they really do have complete control over what sustains the government of North Korea. A big part of that is the sale of anthracite coal across the border, and the sanctions did speak to that sale. And I think that's an area where I think we have to hold China accountable to comporting with the sanctions that were put in place by the UN, and just we have to call people out on it when we view they're not complying.
So there might be an opportunity to exploit there with respect to the reliance on anthracite coal to ensure that the missile and nuclear programs, they comply with international law and our security interests.
Well, under the UN resolutions, North Korea has already violated those on multiple occasions with both the nuclear tests, including the one most recently in September, as well as their firing of test.
I'm going to interject, which is D.C. talk for interrupt. But so what would you suggest to the President of the United States he considered doing to wield more effective influence over China's decision-making on North Korea? In 10 seconds or less, please.
Well, it does involve a concerted response from our allies as well, Japan, North Korea, and making sure China understands, as part of this whole of China approach, that this is an important element of what they can do to strengthen our relationship, or they can do to weaken our relationship with them.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Senator Murphy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for sticking this out. Mr. Tillerson, I know this is a long day. I want to come back to the issue of human rights, because I do worry that there are going to be a lot of human rights advocates, a lot of people who are hoping that the United States maintains its leadership role on maintaining and promoting human rights around the world, who are going to be very worried by some of your testimony here today. Asked about the 3,500 extrajudicial killings in the Philippines, you weren't yet ready to say that you had enough evidence to call that a violation of human rights. Similar answer on Saudi Arabia, and a similar answer with respect to the war crimes perpetuated by the Russians inside Syria. So I guess the simple question for you is this: if you're not ready to say today that what's happening in the Philippines is a human rights violation, despite the fact that the president brags about killing people without trial, or the denial of rights to women in Saudi Arabia as a named human rights violation, or what's happening in Syria as a war crime, can you maybe give us a little bit of a sense of what countries today you would consider to be violators of human rights, or how you are going to make judgments about where the U.S. pursues human rights violators and where we don't? Because I think it'll be a surprise to a lot of people coming out of this hearing that you aren't ready today to call President Duterte a violator of human rights, or to call what's happening in Saudi Arabia a named violation of human rights under international law.
Well, I think somewhere in your question there, Senator Murphy, was in fact the answer. I'm going to act on factual information. I'm not going to act on what people write about in the newspapers, or even what people may brag they've done, because people brag about things that they may or may not have done. I'm going to act on the facts, and if confirmed, I'm going to have access to a lot of information that I don't have access today. It's just my nature to not prejudge events, or prejudge and make conclusions, or conclude that someone has in fact violated this norm, or in fact now meets the standard to be labeled this, until I have seen those facts myself. That should in no way suggest that if those acts that you've described are backed up by the facts, I would agree with your labeling and characterization. I'm just not willing to do that on the record today, because I've not seen that information. So please don't confuse that with my standards are no different than yours.
But just let's take Philippines for an example. I mean, I don't know that there's anybody on this committee that would deny that there are extrajudicial killings happening in the Philippines. That's been widely reported. Our embassy has reported it. The president himself talks about it. What more information do you need before deeming the Philippines to be a human rights violator? What's happening there is a massacre that's there for everyone to see.
I'm sure the committee has seen a lot of evidence that I've not seen. I'm not disputing your conclusion. You're asking me to make a judgment on only what I'm being told. That's not how I make judgments.
So what information in that case would you need? Who would you need to hear from?
I would want to see the factual basis behind the statistics and the factual connection as to who is committing those acts.
Well, a lot of times the factual evidence is reporting. by objective observers on the ground. I'm not initially sure you're going to get a videotape of an extrajudicial killing. So oftentimes the evidence is the objective reporting we get from sources on the ground inside a place like the Philippines.
I will rely on multiple sources to confirm what I am being told. That is, you can blame it on me being an engineer. It's just the engineer in me that I deal with facts, and then I analyze, and then I conclude. And I'm sure there's a lot of credible information out there that I simply haven't seen.
This is a question that often gets asked of members of Congress to judge their view of politics and conflict in the Middle East. It's a pretty simple one. Do you believe that the Iraq War, not the conduct of the war, but the war itself, was a mistake?
I think I indicated in response, I believe it was to Senator Paul's question, that I think our motives were commendable, but we did not achieve the objectives there. We did not achieve greater stability. We did not achieve improved national security for the United States of America. And that's just, the events have borne that out. And at the time, I held the same view, that I was concerned, just as I was concerned before the decisions were made to go into Libya and change the leadership there. It's not that I endorsed that leadership, but that leadership had the place somewhat stable with a lot of bad actors locked up in prison. Now all those bad actors are running around the world. So it's just a question. It's a question of, it isn't a question that our ultimate goal has to be to change that type of oppressive leadership. It has to be, though, that we know what is coming after, or we have a high confidence that we can control what comes after or influence it, and it will be better than what we just took out.
But in this case, which motives are you referring to that were commendable?
I think the concerns were that Saddam Hussein represented a significant threat to stability in that part of the world and to the United States directly. And so I understand that people were looking at information that was available to them, information that's not available to me, at least at this point. So I'm making this comment as a casual observer.
One last question, going back to Russia. You said in answer to an earlier question that you wouldn't commit today to the continuation of sanctions against the Russians for their involvement in the U.S. presidential election. But could you make a commitment to us today that if you deem sanctions to be the inappropriate policy, that you will recommend and argue for a substitute response for the interference in U.S. elections? Will you argue for a U.S. response, even if you don't believe sanctions is the right policy?
Yes, yes. And all I've read is, again, the unclassified portions, but it is troubling. And if there's additional information that indicates the level of interference, it deserves a response.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Just to follow up, our embassies in countries have pretty massive capabilities that are well known. If in the Philippines, for instance, our embassy there assessed to you with very high confidence, since you're not going to be able to be on the ground checking things out yourself in a 70,000 person organization, 75,000, and you're going to have to rely on people that, as you did as an engineer and certainly as CEO of a company, if they assess that extrajudicial killings were taking place, that would probably be enough evidence for you that he was a human rights violator, would it not be?
In all likelihood, it would.
Just to follow up on one other thing, I know this committee passed very strongly in a bipartisan way, and now it's been through multiple iterations of appropriations and now an authorization, a bill to end modern slavery, to work in partnership with others around the world. And I say this because I visited a place in the Philippines where much of that is occurring, and thank you for reminding me. But do you plan to continue to support the effort that's been authorized here and has been appropriated to work in conjunction with the world community to end one of the greatest blights in the world today, and that is 27 million people in the world being enslaved more than at any time in the world's history?
I think it is part of America's moral clarity and our values that we must speak out, and not just speak out, but take action to cause countries that are allowing this to go on or facilitating it worse, to cause them to change that. And I know that this is a particularly passionate issue to yourself and other members of the committee, and I want to enlarge it to human trafficking at large as well. Slavery and human trafficking have to be addressed, and America has to lead in this particular area.
Thank you so much. Senator Isaacson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Tillerson, thank you very much for your candor and your respect you've exhibited for the committee and the process. We're proud of your nomination and commend you to the Senate. I'm going to ask one question, and then I'm going to waive the rest of my time so we can get a little rest. One of the important roles of the State Department, I went back to the State Department before, is some of the soft power. And part of our soft power is our ability to solve problems that nobody else can solve. Most recent example, Ebola. When the Ebola outbreak took place in West Africa, it was the CDC that created the mechanism by which we actually stopped Ebola. And now we have a vaccine that will prevent Ebola, which is a great victory for humanity and a great victory for the process. The money that was done to treat the initial patients from West Africa was a special appropriation of the United States Senate and the House to create an emergency fund to deal with Ebola. During the same period of time, the State Department had referred a Lassa fever patient to the CDC, to Emory University to take care of, and which they did. There was no funds available for that Lassa payment, and to this date, Emory has not been reimbursed for that payment, for that treatment. My question is, it seems to be a good time for us to look at the CDC, which is the heart of the solution, and create an emergency fund reserve where we have an amount of money available to the CDC secretary that they can immediately go to use for an emergency like Ebola or like Lassa fever. I'm going to work to try and establish that this year, and I hope as the Secretary of State, when you're confirmed, you'll work with me to do that.
I look forward to that, Senator, and engaging with you on it. I think you're right. The CDC's response in the Ebola outbreak was remarkably well managed. I would make an observation, because all of this at some point gets to somebody's got to pay for all this. And in examining how the World Health Organization did in these outbreaks, I think what it exposed was some deficiencies within the World Health Organization as well, that they were not able to respond. And that's where normally, this was an outbreak occurred in another part of the world, they should have been the first responders to the scene. But as you point out, CDC as well as other U.S. assets had to be put in to those countries to address that. So I think it's worth an examination as we're considering CDC's role. It's worth an examination of how that interfaces in these types of outbreaks, whether it's Ebola or the Zika virus. How's that interface working with the global health organizations as well?
Thank you very much for your time, and congratulations on your nomination.
Senator Markey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Tillerson, do you agree with President-elect Trump when he said, quote, "It wouldn't be a bad thing for us if Japan, South Korea, or Saudi Arabia acquired nuclear weapons"?
Senator, I don't think anyone advocates for more nuclear weapons on the planet.
Donald Trump said it would not be a bad thing. Do you agree with that or disagree with that?
I do not agree.
You do not agree. Would you commit to working vigorously to ensure that no additional country on the planet obtains a nuclear weapons capacity?
Senator, I think if confirmed, it is one of the vital roles for the State Department to play in working in the National Security Council in an interagency way has to be the pursuit of nuclear nonproliferation. We just simply cannot back away from our commitment to see a reduction in the number of these weapons on the planet.
Okay. President-elect Trump recently said on Twitter that, in his view, the United States must, quote, expand its nuclear capability. When warned that this could trigger an arms race, he replied, "Let it be an arms race. Do you agree with President-elect Trump that the United States should welcome a nuclear arms race with Russia or with China? Would that be a good thing for the United States?
Senator, I think as we're pursuing nonproliferation and we're also pursuing the enforcement of important agreements like New START, that we have to also approach those from a position of strength. I think in the context of some of the quotes that you're running through here, the President-elect has also indicated a commitment to ensuring that the level of nuclear arms and capability that we are going to maintain under agreed treaties, that those capabilities must be maintained, and that from time to time that means we've got to renew them and bring them up to date and ensure that they are capable. Otherwise, we now have an asymmetric arrangement with people we're negotiating with.
Right. It just, that's at odds with what he has been quoted publicly as saying, so I just think it's important for us to hear you take a position that, in fact, negotiations towards reducing the nuclear threat rather than having a new nuclear arms race is much better for our country and the global security. If you are confirmed, will you commit to protect the rights of all career employees of the State Department, so that they retain their right to speak with Congress?
As pursuant to an open and effective dialogue with Congress, would encourage that issues are put on the table for discussion with the Congress, yes.
You just had, I think, a great conversation with Senator Isaacson about global health issues. And one of our great achievements over the last couple of decades has been the establishment and investment in PEPFAR and U.S. leadership in the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, TB, and malaria. Millions of lives have been saved and health infrastructure has been built in the developing world. Could you discuss your view of those programs and your commitment to strengthening them in the years ahead?
PEPFAR is just really one of the remarkable successes of the past decade or more, obviously begun under President Bush. And I think what's notable about PEPFAR is there are measurable results. Very well managed, very well targeted at getting at those three diseases. I think it serves as a model for us to look to as we're thinking about other ways in which to project America's values, project our compassion to want to solve these threats that are in other parts of the world that, by and large, we're not threatened by a lot of this here in this country. Malaria eradicated decades ago, TB well under control, AIDS, great treatment programs available to people. Projecting that into other parts of the world is a marvelous way to send the message of the compassion of the American people, that we care about people's lives all over the world. So PEPFAR is a terrific model to look at in the future as we think about other areas that may be useful for us to put additional programs in place.
Now, I'd like to move on to another global health issue as it impacts the United States. And again, this is the opioid epidemic. It's now been transformed into a fentanyl issue. In Massachusetts this year, in New Hampshire, Senator Shaheen's home state, 3/4 of the people who died in 2016 of opioid overdose died from fentanyl. And if it was occurring at the same rate across the country as it did in Massachusetts in 2016, that would be 75,000 people a year dying from fentanyl overdoses. Now, the way this is coming into America is pretty much the chemicals come in from China, they go down to Mexico, and then they're trafficked in out of Mexico into the regions of the country. Senator Rubio has a similar problem in Florida. We need to elevate this issue, Mr. Secretary, to a much higher level of importance in our country. The terrorist that's going to kill Americans on the streets of our country are the terrorists who are selling fentanyl. It's the Mexican and Chinese operatives who are funneling this into our country. That is the terrorist fear in the hearts of Americans. Can you talk about how strong you intend on ensuring that the State Department takes in terms of actions to tell the Chinese and the Mexicans how serious we are about this threat, this existential threat to families all across our country?
Senator, if confirmed, this will require an interagency approach, both in terms of applying many of the tools that have been used in terror financing elsewhere to track the flow of money, attempt to disrupt on both ends of that. Because I think it's one thing, we can send the Chinese a message, but it's another then to put in place the mechanisms, whether it be working with Treasury and other parts of the interagency process, to disrupt the flow of these materials and these drugs as well. Clearly, we have a message to project to China, but I'm also clear-eyed about China just suddenly say, oh, okay, never mind.
A wall across our southern border will not keep the fentanyl out. It's going to take much tougher action if we're going to save, ultimately, 2 Vietnams per year of deaths inside of the United States from that one drug. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Barrasso.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your patience in staying with us. I had just a couple questions to follow up on some things that you've been asked already. A little earlier, you were talking about the efficiency and effectiveness of PEPFAR, and that government can at times do things well. The American public also knows that government is full of waste and fraud and abuse. You saw some of it in the private sector, and you'll see it in government. And I just want, with the kind of debt that we have as a nation, to know that you're committed also to, when you see it, to eliminating duplication, eliminating redundancies, and do what you can to try to address this incredible debt that we have.
Well, Senator, I'm obviously very good. It's just in my nature to look for inefficiencies and to streamline, and that will start, if confirmed, it'll start right there in the State Department itself in terms of assessing the organization structure of the State Department. I know as part of preparing, I've looked at organization charts from a few years ago to organization charts today, and I've noticed there are a few more boxes. Now, some of those may be for very good and valid reasons, but also it appears to me that new issues which have been added may rightfully need to be placed back into the mission and integrated into the mission itself, because it appears to me we've got some duplication, but it's not only about saving the American taxpayers' dollars and spending them wisely, it's also about the delivery on the issue. If we've got it dispersed in several places, we're probably not dealing with the issue very effectively either, because there's lack of clarity as to how does this issue integrate into the missions obligations and what we're trying to achieve in the various missions of the State Department. So I just give you that as a simple example because it was so obvious to me when I began to look at the chart. So I know there will be opportunities to streamline things with the objective primarily of being more effective in terms of how we carry out the State Department's mission, making sure people understand what they own, having clarity, line of sight to who's accountable, and then out of that, I think will come we'll naturally going to capture some efficiencies and cost savings.
Another topic that was discussed was human rights, and as we travel around the world, we talk to leaders around the world who are concerned about security in their nations, economic growth in their nations, and somewhat human rights, but perhaps not to the degree that we would like to see that commitment. And these are people that we have interests with in terms of our own global security. So as Secretary of State, how do you balance engaging these countries in terms of trying to protect their security, as well as the economic aspect, as well as protecting and focusing on human rights?
Well, Senator, I take the view that it's never an either-or choice we make. I think as it's been said, our values are our interest, and our interests are our values. So regardless of what we may be dealing with, our values are never not right sitting on our shoulder in full display, on the table. I think the real question you're trying to get to is how do we advance those values, though, against other priorities at the time. And I did, and again, just speaking in an honest assessment in my opening remarks, acknowledge that from time to time, our national security may have to take the priority. It doesn't mean our values were deprioritized. It doesn't mean they're not still as important. It doesn't mean they're not right here on our shoulder with us. It's really, I think what you're asking is, how do we project those values to another country in a negotiation in a way that they begin to move closer to our values? That is always there, and it is never an either-or choice.
And then the last thing I wanted to get to was the issue of energy as a master resource in the way that Putin uses it as a political weapon. And one of the things we're seeing now is this Nord Stream 2 pipeline. The pipeline between Russia and Germany that the United States has been working closely with our European partners with respect to that. And this is something that we've had bipartisan support on. Looking across the aisle, Senator Shaheen, Senator Murphy have signed a letter with me and with Senator Risch and Senator Rubio, Senator Johnson, because of our concern with the ability with this pipeline to deliver more energy and make Europe more dependent upon Russia for energy. It also bypasses Ukraine and impacts the Ukrainian economy as well when it runs directly from Russia under the Baltic Sea directly into Germany. Several European countries have raised the concerns that this pipeline would undermine sanctions on Russia, increase Russia's political leverage over Eastern Europe. And could you give us your assessment of something in which there's actually a lot of bipartisan agreement on this panel with regard to?
Well, energy is vital to every economy the world over, so it can be used as a powerful tool to influence, kind of tip the balance of the table in one party's direction or the other. So it is important that we are watching and paying attention to when this balance is upset. The greatest response the United States can give to that threat is the development of our own natural resources. The country is blessed with enormous natural resources of both oil and natural gas, and I know the Congress took action here in the recent past to approve the export of crude oil. We now have exports of liquefied natural gas. The more supply, more U.S. supply, which comes from a stable country that lives by our values, we can provide optionality to countries so that they are not cannot be held captive to a single source or to a dominant source. That's a physical response to that issue. I think from a policy standpoint, it's engaging with countries to make sure they understand they have choices and what those choices are, and what can we do in foreign policy to help them gain access to multiple choices so they're not captive to just one or a dominant source.
Well, thank you. Thank you for your willingness to serve. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Booker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, I want to thank you. This has been a very long process, and you've showed a remarkable amount of poise and equipoise and endurance. So thank you very much. I'd like to pick up on something that Senator Shaheen was asking you about, which is just issues with our Muslim allies around the globe as well as Muslim countries. You've been really in resonating with my spirit pretty strong in talking about the Muslim faith. You even called it, as I wrote down when you said it, the great faith. And it shows a level of respect and deference that I'm sure will serve you well as Secretary of State, should you be confirmed. What I worry about is a lot of the rhetoric coming from the President-elect and others really does undermine often our relationships with a lot of our allies. When I was traveling through the Middle East in countries like Jordan, for example, I was surprised that people at the highest level of their government were directly concerned about the rhetoric coming from individual leaders in this country. The President-elect has said that he would consider Muslim Americans being required to register in a government database. I just want to ask you directly, you don't support a Muslim registry, do you, for people coming into this country based on religion?
Senator, I think in response to that question, I do not support targeting any particular group. If a registry of some sort that's broadly applied to any person entering the country that could present a threat.
So, sir, I'm sorry to interrupt you. My time is short. let's just use specifically the NSEERS program, the National Security Entry Exit Registry System. I introduced legislation last week to eliminate that potentially, and under the Bush administration, there were about 25 countries registered. All of them were Muslim countries that were in that NSEERS program, except for one, which was North Korea. That was then the policy of the Obama administration was to zero out that registry. Is that something you would support? The NSEERS mechanism is still there, and how would that affect our ability to deal with countries that we're working so closely with, such as Jordan, which was my example?
Senator, I appreciate the question. I'm not familiar enough to be able to address it specifically. I'm happy to get back to you with an answer, though.
No, sir, I appreciate that. How does it affect, in your opinion, our ability to work with Muslim countries? For example, when people like General Michael Flynn has publicly called Islam a political ideology, not a religion, saying that it's like cancer, and writing that fear of Muslims is rational, that can't be constructive to our foreign policy, to our diplomacy with key countries in Southeast Asia, as well as the Middle East.
My experience, Senator, has been the best relationships in which you can make progress on tough issues is built on mutual respect of one another, which then leads to hopefully mutual trust. Just as we want to be trusted, as whether we're Christians or we practice the faith of Judaism or whatever our religious faith may be, and in this country we have the freedom to practice that in any way we want. That we want to be respected for that as well. But that relationship has to be built on a mutual respect for each other and not a judgment about one's faith.
Sir, I'm really grateful, not that I'm surprised at all, but I'm grateful for you putting forth those very important values. Could you answer me this? What do you think it does to our enemies' ability to push forth more propaganda about the West or incite more radicalism when you hear these evil terrorist organizations? What do you think it does to their recruiting efforts when rhetoric like that comes from the highest levels of leadership in our country?
Well, I think these radical Islamic factions that we've been talking about, whether it's ISIS or Al-Qaeda, they have broad networks, obviously, that they're putting in place, and that's what we've got to disrupt. We've got to disrupt their ability to reach large numbers of people who could be persuaded, and that's what I've spoken to earlier with new tools to advance our ability to do that.
Sharing intelligence with other Muslim majority nations, cooperating with them, creating those relationships that you said are so important. It's important to counter ISIL, but if you're insulting and demeaning their very faith, not only does it make it probably more difficult to deal with your allies, but it might even incite more radicalism, potentially, correct?
My expectation is that we're going to be able to re-engage with our traditional friends and allies in the region, not just in the Middle East, but I think, as you pointed out, there are large Muslim populations in Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Malaysia, other important countries in that part of the world where we have serious issues of common interest as well.
Again, there's much about our conversation privately that I appreciated, and as much about your testimony that I appreciate as well. One thing we discussed was just how important USAID is when we were together. I have real concerns now, having been out and around the globe, seeing the powerful impact the USAID is making for really asserting human dignity. I really worry that its budget has been cut. The base international affairs budget, which includes funding to state and USAID, has been repeatedly cut about 30%, adjusted for inflation, since fiscal year 2010, despite the fact that across multiple bipartisan administrations, there's always been a broad agreement that supporting both USAID and the State Department is a moral, economic, and strategic perspective. I just want to just hope that you will be, especially, I've read a lot about the way you ran your private business, streamlining and the like, but I hope that a priority for yours is a more robust USAID program. Is that something I have, could you give me reason to hope?
Well, I think, I hope what you're after is more effective programs with better use of the taxpayers' dollars, and to the extent we are good at that and we have even greater opportunity, then we should seek additional funding. But there will be a complete and comprehensive review of how effective we are with the dollars over there. USAID, as I said, is an important part of the projection of America's values around the world. We're going to have, I think there is a joint strategic plan that is required between the State Department and USAID in fiscal year 2017. That's going to be a perfect opportunity for me and those who will be working with me, if I'm confirmed over at the State Department, to take a comprehensive look at the effectiveness and what are our ranges of opportunities out there that might argue for greater funding. So I want to be effective with the program and make sure that as we are using the taxpayers' dollars, they're delivering a result that we're proud of.
And that's something I respect. I was a mayor, our chairman was a mayor. We know that spending more money on a problem doesn't necessarily mean that you're dealing with it more effectively. But if you do have effective evidence-based programs, investing more resources is a strategic as well as a human rights advantage. Sir, I'm a low man on the totem pole, and I'm done with my time. I do want to say this to the chairman.
Well, you had an extra minute this morning, so go ahead. You're high man on the totem pole now. You have the mic.
If only people told me this committee was so magnanimous as it is. Sir, I'm just going to use my last few seconds. I'm not sure if we're going to have another round. We're not. My ranking member is not. So I just want to just...
If by agreement with others, if I could, there's been, I think, a request to all members asking. I know there's some members that want to go another round, and we're going to make that available
I've expressed
to them today.
my thoughts to my ranking member, and I'll wait for his instruction, but in the few seconds I have left, I just want you to know that this is probably one of the more important positions on the planet Earth, the one to which you're nominated for. It's not just about it is obviously always looking for America's interest and strategic advantage, but it also it's about American values, values of human rights, values of taking care of poor and marginalized people. And I expect that you at some point will be confirmed, and I look forward to working with you to asserting those values of human dignity as well as American interest abroad. So thank you, sir.
If I might, Mr. Chairman, before you call on the next witness, because for my members, there are some additional questions that members who have asked second rounds want to ask, and we're going to try to be able to give you the time. But it is possible if we all cooperate, we might be able to complete this hearing this evening and not go into tomorrow. So that's what we're trying to do. Obviously, we have to complete it by 6 o'clock because we have business on the floor at 6 o'clock.
I saw the look of disappointment on Mr. Tillerson's face. As I understand it, Senator Rubio will have additional questions. Senator Menendez, Senator Shaheen has a little bit. For those members who, Senator Risch, so we may be here tomorrow, but it looks like we're going to try to finish this evening if everybody can cooperate. And again, if that's not the case, as we all know, we're perfectly willing to come back tomorrow. We're really trying to accommodate the members.
And I appreciate the chairman. He's been very open about that, and it's been very helpful. We also have some members that have not had their second rounds yet. We know that.
Yeah. And now to Senator Portman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, Mr. Tillerson, thanks for your willingness to be patient and answer the questions as you have with candor, and appreciate your willingness to serve. One thing we didn't talk about this morning in my questions was the Middle East. And I know you've had a lot of experience in the Middle East, particularly you've done business in many of the Arab countries. We talked about this a little in our meeting, but this relationship we have with Israel is a special one, of course. It's a cornerstone of our strategy in the Middle East. They are our greatest ally in the Middle East, the one true democracy. I want to talk to you a little about your views on Israel and the U.S.-Israel relationship. One important issue for me, as you know, is this issue of boycott, divestment, and sanction movement, the so-called BDS movement, which is a global movement targeting Israel. I've been concerned about this for a while, introduced some legislation on it. In fact, Ben Cardin and I have not just introduced, but passed legislation in this regard to try to push back against the BDS forces. Recently, of course, with the consent of the Obama administration, the UN Security Council passed this resolution condemning the settlements and demanding Israel cease all activities in the occupied Palestinian territories, including East Jerusalem, is the way the resolution reads. I think this will no doubt galvanize additional BDS activity. And so here's my question to you. Would you make it a priority to counter boycott, divestment, and sanctions efforts against Israel, make sure Israel is not held to a double standard, but instead treated as a normal member of the international community?
Yes, I would.
Any preliminary thoughts as to how you would do that?
Well, I think just by raising it in our interactions with countries that do put in place provisions that boycott whatever elements of activity or business with Israel in their country, that we begin by highlighting that we oppose that and just expressing that view, and that those countries need to understand that it does shade our view of them as well then. One of the things that would, I think, help change the dynamic, obviously, would be if there were a change in the dynamic regionally. Today, because of Iran and the threat that Iran poses, we now find that Israel, the U.S., and the Arab neighbors in the region all share the same enemy. And this gives us an opportunity to discuss things that previously, I think, could not have been discussed.
Do you find more support among the Sunni countries in the region for Israel as a result of that new dynamic?
I don't want to speak for them, Senator, but I think clearly there's much more sharing going on between the leaders of those countries as they confront this singular threat to the whole region.
That's my sense, and I think it's an opportunity. On BDS, we do have legislation that ties trade negotiations to dismantling BDS, and would you support that legislation? It's law of the land, and as we conduct trade negotiations, would you support using those negotiations to help dismantle the BDS efforts in those countries?
From the standpoint of the State Department's view, if confirmed, I would advocate for that position as well, recognizing there's other agencies that will really have the purview over that.
What attitude do you take toward the UN initiatives relating to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? Is it your intention to press the Palestinians to resume negotiations with Israel rather than seeking to negotiate through international bodies such as the UN? What's your position on that?
I think, as I've expressed in answers to a couple other questions, I don't want to be brief because I realize we're trying to get through questions quickly. This issue has to be settled between the Israelis and the Palestinians, and no one can be coerced into coming to the negotiating table. That will not lead to a solution. So I support the parties being allowed to deal with this, speaking for themselves.
With regard to Syria, complicated, obviously. In my view, it's been made worse by our inaction and specifically drawing red lines and not honoring them, but also not establishing safe zones and no-fly zones. And as you know, Russia's entry into Syria's civil war has helped turn the tide decisively. So Iran was strongly backing Assad, and now you have Russia more involved. And this Assad or Iran Hezbollah axis has been strengthened. And yet, as an indication of how complicated it is over there, an enemy of that axis, of course, would be ISIS. One of my questions for you is, would you, under any circumstances, advise any sort of cooperation with Iran where we might have a confluence of interest, namely in confronting ISIS?
That's an area that requires exploration. I think, and earlier I indicated that that's where we've got to find a way to engage in the overall peace process, or the ceasefire process, that's been agreed by Russia, Turkey, Syria, and with Iran's involvement as well. Can we get engaged in that? Can we at least stabilize the situation regarding the rebel activity with the Syrian government and turn all our attention on ISIS? That remains to be seen, and that will involve, obviously, the engagement of others as well, and input from others as well.
Do you think Russia has an interest or desire in this conflict to push back against ISIS, or do you think they're simply in Syria to help Assad's regime?
I think it has provided a convenient open door for Russia to now establish a presence in the Middle East, a region that it has long been absent from. Having said that, though, there are common threats that Russia faces because of terrorist organizations and radical Islam themselves. I've seen statistics that are significant. The significant fighters in ISIS are all speaking Russian as a language. That indicates Russia's got a problem as well in terms of where those people came from and where they may go back home to. So I think there's scope for discussion. This is what I alluded to earlier. we will have to see what Russia's posture is. Are they looking for a partnership with us where we can try to reestablish some type of a positive working relationship, or are they uninterested in that?
Again, an incredibly, complex situation and difficult part of the world, but my sense is that Russia has not followed through on its statements with regard to pushing back on ISIS in Syria, and in fact have focused on simply protecting Assad's regime. Again, thank you for your willingness to step forward into some of these complicated situations. We are looking forward to the opportunity to working together with you going forward, and I wish you the best of luck.
Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Markley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I have 10 articles, I mentioned one or two earlier, that I'd like to submit for the record related to Exxon's involvement regarding sanctions and Russia's activity in Ukraine.
Without objection.
Thank you. I wanted to turn to climate, the environment, and of course you've received many, many questions today, and we talked about this some in my office, I think is a reflection on how important it is. As we look down a few generations from now, people will say, here was a major threat to the planet, what did you all do? And you noted earlier in your conversation with the chairman that our ability to predict the impacts of climate change are very limited. But I believe that when I met with you, you indicated that, but you also indicated that while we can't model with certainty, that shouldn't bother people too much. The fact that we have a risk and challenge, we shouldn't let that go. And I think you continue. So my view has always been it's a serious risk, and we need to take steps to address it. Is that a fair recounting of how you view it?
Yes, sir. I think, I think what I said is the fact that we cannot predict with precision, and certainly all of the models that we discussed that day, none of them agree, doesn't mean that we should do nothing.
One of the things I've seen in my time here in the Senate is we've gone from talking about models in the future to talking about what's happening on the ground right now. In my state, the forests are burning at a much faster rate due to pine beetle expansion and the additional heat and dryness. And over on the coast, the oysters are having trouble reproducing because the ocean is 30% more acidic than before we started burning fossil fuels. In Senator Shaheen's state, the moose are dying because the ticks aren't killed off during the winter and they're transmitting disease. And along the coast with Senator Kuhn's state, I think accurately the lowest average land level in the country, and very concerned about the advancing sea level and storms, and experienced that in Hurricane Sandy. And so every one of us in our states are seeing facts on the ground. And as we see that, we're just at the beginning of these impacts, that they're getting worse each year. But we are also viewing often climate change as a national security issue. Since you believe, I wanted to ask, do you see it as a national security issue?
I don't see it as the imminent national security threat that perhaps others do.
One of the things that's noted is how the changing climate in the Middle East concentrated Syrian villages into the towns and sparked the civil war that has now produced something like 4 million and counting refugees, having profound impacts on European security. And that would be an example. Is that something you've looked at or considered to be real, or perhaps misleading, or any thoughts in that regard?
The facts on the ground are indisputable in terms of what's happening with drought, disease, insect populations, all the things you cite. Now, the science behind the clear connection is not conclusive, and there are many reports out there that we are unable yet to connect specific events to climate change alone.
Yes. What we're seeing are a lot of scientific reports that will say, we can tell you the odds increased. We can't tell you any specific event was the direct consequence. For example, Hurricane Sandy might have occurred in a 100-year period, but the odds of it happening are higher with the higher sea level, higher energy in the storms. So, but do you agree with that viewpoint, that that essentially the odds of dramatic events occurring, whether it's more forest fires or more hurricanes with more power, is a rational observation from the scientific literature?
I think, as you indicated, that there's some literature out there that suggests that. There's other literature that says it's inconclusive.
One of the things I'm sorry to hear that viewpoint, because it's overwhelmingly, the scales are on one side of this argument, and I hope you'll continue to look at the scientific literature and take it seriously. One of the things that you mentioned was it was impressive that so many countries came together in Paris as a part of a global effort to take this on. And that was an important outcome, that there's a global conversation. I just want to make sure that I'm capturing correctly your impression of Paris.
As I've stated before in my statements around climate change and responses to it, that it will require a global response, and that countries that attempt to influence this by acting alone are probably only harming themselves. So the global approach was an important step, and I think also, as I indicated in response to a question earlier, I think it's important that the U.S. maintain a seat at that table so that we can also judge the level of commitment of the other 189 or so countries that are around that table and chart, and again, adjust our own course accordingly.
Is this a case where really American leadership in the world matters? We rarely see big efforts to take on global problems unless America is driving the conversation. Do you think it's important for America to drive this conversation?
Well, I think it's important for us to have a seat at the table, but I also think it's important that others need to step forward and decide whether this is important to them or not. If America is the only one that's willing to lead, then my conclusion is the rest of the world doesn't think it's very important.
Yeah. We saw in the sanctions on Iran, it was America that led, and then we brought the rest of the world to the table. We also saw that leading up to Paris, China is committed to producing as much renewable power as our entire electricity production in the United States. And we've seen India now talking about how to shift providing electricity to 300 million people who don't have it, and doing it primarily, or shifting from primarily a coal strategy to primarily renewable energy strategy. So we're seeing big countries with big populations that have far smaller carbon footprints than the United States stepping up, and shouldn't we step up as well?
I think the United States has stepped up, and as I indicated earlier, I think the United States has a record over the last 20 years of which it can be quite proud.
Thank you. And it sounds like that means you think we should keep not just being at a table. To be at a table, you can be table silent, but a table, an active participant in taking on this challenge.
I think it's important that we are engaged in that same conversation, as I said, so we have a clear view of what others are doing and the actions they're taking.
Thank you. Am I out of time?
You are, if you would like to take 30 seconds.
Earlier, thank you. I'll take those 30 seconds. Earlier, we talked about the Exxon working with a subsidiary to bypass American sanctions and do business with Iran. And you said you didn't have knowledge of it, hadn't heard about it. Have you participated in any Exxon meetings in which you strategize, or individuals strategize to find a legal path to do business with nations on which we had sanctions?
No.
Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Risch.
Thank you. Ms. Tillerson, several questions ago in an answer you stated, and I was delighted to hear that you had reservations occasionally when the United States acts about what was going to happen afterwards if a regime changed. Let me tell you that that's a refreshing view up here. I sit on this committee, of course I sit on the Intelligence Committee, and we hear proposals all the time, and we hear of actions people want to take all the time, but they can't answer the question of, okay, what's going to happen next? And that is something I hope you will remain committed to while you're at this job, and when you're sitting at that table and those decisions are being made. I hope you'll insist that people tell you what's going to happen next, because we have been very, very short on strategy after being able to topple a regime. If we want to do it, we can do it. We've got the power to do it. But then what comes next? And everyone, for a long time around here, I heard, well, we're going to do nation building and everything's going to be wonderful. It's going to be a new America when we're done with them. Well, the nation building was a great strategy in the World War II era, and it worked. That strategy isn't working anymore. We have been notoriously unsuccessful in attempting to do nation building, and part of it is because there's a lot of reasons for it. But obviously, one of them is that we're operating in countries where the culture is so much different than ours, very different from the landscape in World War II and after World War II. So again, I want to encourage you to take that question to the table every time. Say, okay, guys, I see what you've got planned. I think it's going to work. What happens next? Because that is an incredibly important decision when we decide what we're going to do. Let me shift gears here for a minute. I want to talk about the Iran situation. As you know, there are a lot of us up here that were very much opposed to the deal that was cut by the current administration with Iran. There's a lot of us up here that believe we're not done yet. This thing has set Iran on a path towards having a nuclear weapon. Now, it's going to be some time. I couldn't agree more that it's going to be further down the road as a result of the deal. But it gives them, in my judgment, a legal path forward if they continue to do all the things that they're required to do in the agreement and take it step by step and year by year, and then the agreement expires and they're going to say, okay, we're done. We did everything we said we're going to do. Now we're going to build a bomb. And if people object, they're going to say, well, wait a second. You know, we negotiated in good faith. We did everything we said we were going to do. Why, you know? So that's not over. But what's more concerning is the more instant question, and that is a lot of us at this table, particularly on this side of the table, urged the administration in very clear terms, both in open hearings and in closed hearings, to push the Iranians to behave themselves, to change their conduct, not quit fiddling with enrichment and what have you. These people are the primary sponsor of the greatest sponsor of terrorist activity in the world. When they were talking about giving them however many $1 billion it was on pallets, we said, look, these people have been financing terrorist activities when they were broke. What do you think is going to happen when we make them rich? And they said, well, you know, we don't want to do that because it'll interfere with what we're talking about on the nuclear deal. And to me, it wasn't worth the deal at all when they limited it just to that. When it comes to the UN sanctions or the UN resolutions that have been passed that said you've got to behave yourself. For instance, you can't launch missiles anymore. I mean, 1 week after the thing went into effect, they were launching missiles. There's a lot of us here that want to reimpose sanctions, in fact, ratchet sanctions up for their activities on terrorism, for their failure to obey the UN sanctions on missile activity. And the Iranians are saying, no, you know, you can't put any more sanctions on us. In fact, some people up here are arguing that that's not the case. We believe look, the administration themselves said that it didn't cover those the agreement didn't cover those activities. It was limited to nuclear. Do you have a view on that? Because I think you're going to be dealing with that sooner rather than later. There's a lot of us that feel very strongly about that. And if we're going to change these people's attitude about joining the world stage with the rest of civilized society, we're going to have to curtail their activities, not just in the nuclear area, but in these other things that are just despicable acts that they commit. Have you got some views on that?
Well, I think I may have commented earlier that one of the unfortunate effects of all the attention placed on the Iran nuclear agreement, I think at least I've heard this expressed by others, resulted in a bit of a down focus on the real immediate threat today, and that's Iran's continued sponsorship of terrorism and terrorist organizations there in the region, most particularly support for Hezbollah and Hamas. So I think we do have to keep what's important in front of us and what's imminent in front of us. As to the nuclear agreement itself, I do look forward, if confirmed, to taking a comprehensive look at that, along with the side agreements, to see what are all the elements available to us to stay informed on their activities, and are they complying with all the inspection requirements and confirming that they're meeting the agreement. But back to your point of what happens next in the case of taking certain regimes out. The same thing is true here with this agreement. It's what happens at the end of this agreement is really the important question we've got to be asking ourselves, because the objective has not changed. Iran cannot have a nuclear agreement. What happens at the end, as you point out, is they go right back to where they were, and we've not achieved our objective. So my intention is to use the elements of this agreement that may be helpful to us in addressing the what comes next when this agreement is over, or what replaces it, which has to be we have once and for all blocked Iran's path to a nuclear weapon, either because they've agreed that they're no longer going to pursue one because they have no reason to, because we've changed behaviors, or because we have mechanisms in place that are going to prevent them from pursuing that. That will be a difficult negotiation because it is in the context of their continued sponsorship of terrorism around the world. And we can't just work this and turn a blind eye to that. And it is a complicated discussion, but I think we do have to take that approach with them. And we're not going to do a one-off deal with you and act like all this stuff over here is not happening. It has to be looked at in full view, and we just have to be honest and acknowledge it.
And that's exactly what happened. I'm encouraged to hear you say that. Let me warn you about one thing. I sit on this committee, I sit on the Intelligence Committee, and I have not seen the side agreements, nor has any member of the United States Congress seen the side agreements. I've traveled to the UN operations in Vienna and met with the IAEA. They will not let you see those side agreements. So these people were voting for, the people who voted for that Iran agreement did so on an agreement that part of which we weren't able to see. So I wish you well. We've had one witness who said she was in the room where they had the side agreements and they were passing them around, and she touched them as they went by, but did not read them. So she wasn't able to tell us either what was in the side agreements. I wish you well. If you get your hands on the side agreements, give me a call, would you? Because I'd like to join you and have a look at them. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Oh, thank you. Senator Coons.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Tillerson, for your fortitude and patience. It bodes well for what I think are the rigors and demands of service as Secretary of State. Since Senator Risch has taken us on a guided tour of the JCPOA, I just thought I would start by going back to an important point that you referenced in passing. I believe earlier today you said one of the failings of the deal is it does not deny Iran the ability to purchase a nuclear weapon, and my very diligent staff has reminded me that the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty does prohibit the purchase of a nuclear weapon. But more importantly, the JCPOA, which I have, in Provision 3 of the general provisions at the very front, says Iran reaffirms that under no circumstances will Iran ever seek, develop, or acquire any nuclear weapons. My general approach to this agreement has been distrust and verify. I couldn't agree with you more that Iran's ongoing activities in their ballistic missile program, their human rights violations domestically, their support for terrorism in the region, make them one of the most dangerous regimes in the world, and one that deserves very close scrutiny. But I didn't want us to move forward without some clarity that at least the paper, at least the words on the page, do say that they committed to not acquiring a nuclear weapon. That was, I think, one of the positives about it, in addition to the inspection protocols. And they're
Senator, if I could correct for the record, I misspoke. And during the break, I went and checked my source for that and confirmed that I misspoke, and that, in fact, their commitment to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the language that was in there about acquire, some people quibble over, but their commitment to the NPT was clear, and I misspoke in that regard.
And thank you. And I appreciate your comment in response to questions from Senator Merkley and others about keeping a seat at the table through the Paris Agreement and the general approach that suggests. I believe climate change is a major concern for us in the long term and the short term, and that it's human caused, and that there are actions we can and should take in response to it. As a trained chemist, I respect your training as an engineer and would urge you to be attentive to the science, because I think it's fairly overwhelming on this point. I do think that the JCPOA structure, the P5+1, that brought it into force and is enforcing it, and the Paris Climate Agreement are two examples of tables where we should have a seat at the table and be advocates and be driving it. I want to ask you about one other table that was literally designed with a seat for the United States that still sits empty. There's been a number of questions and discussion today about the South China Sea and about China's aggressive actions in building islands. The UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, decades ago, was advanced by a Republican administration, but has still never been ratified by this Senate. And in June of 2012, you signed a letter indicating in your role as CEO of ExxonMobil that you supported the Senate's consent to ratification of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. I was a member of this committee when then Chairman John Kerry convened 7 hearings where panel after panel of 4-star admirals and generals and business leaders and national security leaders and former Republican leaders, the administration and senators, all testified in support of this, yet we fell short of ratification. Had we ratified it, we would have that seat at the table to aggressively assert the international law of the sea and to push back on China's actions, which during that debate were hypothetical, today are real. Would you work to support the Law of the Sea Convention if confirmed as Secretary?
Well, I will certainly work with the President. We've not discussed that particular treaty. Certainly my position that I've taken in the past was one from the perspective of the role I had at that time, and I do take note of and I do acknowledge the concerns people have about subjecting any of our activities to international courts. And that's the principal objection that people have. But when given the opportunity, if given the opportunity to discuss this in the Interagency or the National Security Council, I'm sure we'll have a robust discussion about it. I don't know what the President's view is on it, and I wouldn't want to get out ahead of him.
Well, let me ask you about that, if I might, because I came to this hearing with a whole list of questions, and in response to others, you've addressed many of them, where, in my view, you have a notable difference of view from at least some of the concerns based on some campaign statements by the President-elect. No ban on Muslims, no nuclear arms race, no nukes for Japan, South Korea, or Saudi Arabia, no abandoning our NATO allies, no deal with Russia to accept the annexation of Crimea, stay engaged potentially in both the Iran agreement and the Paris Climate Treaty. All of these, to me, are quite encouraging, but they suggest some tension with statements made by the President-elect. How will you work through those differences? And just reassure me that you will stand up to the President when you disagree on what is the right path forward in terms of policy.
Well, I think early in the day, someone asked me a similar question, and I said that one of the reasons that I came to the conclusion, among many, to say yes to President-elect Trump when he asked me to do this, is in my conversations with him on the subject we have discussed, he's been very open and inviting of hearing my views and respectful of those views. I don't think, in terms of discussing or perhaps characterizing it as my willingness to push back on him, my sense is that we're going to have all the views presented on the table, and everyone will be given the opportunity to express those and make their case, and then the President will decide. And I'm not trying to dodge a question in any way, but this is one that I don't know where the President may be, nor do I know where some of the other agencies and departments that'll have input on this will be under the new administration. So I respect their rights to express their views also. And again, as you point out, I'm on the record having signed a letter from my prior position in which I was representing different interests. When I hear all the arguments for myself, I don't want to commit to you that my views might not change if I hear different arguments, because I was looking at it only from a particular perspective.
Well, and a number of senators, myself included, have pressed you on making the transition from CEO of ExxonMobil and its interests and a 41-year career there to representing America's interests. And I understand the concerns about sovereignty that some raised in the hearings. Having sat through the hearings and heard the testimony, I'm convinced that the interests of the United States are best advanced by our acceding to that treaty and ratifying it. I have more questions, but I'll wait for the next round.
And we're beginning that round now. Senator Cardin has deferred to Senator Menendez, and only those who really have questions, I think are going to be acknowledged at this time. However, anybody who wishes to come down can do so. So it's going to be Menendez, Rubio, Shaheen, Cardin, Coons, Cardin, Merkley. Sounds like a pretty full third round, and I'm glad everybody's interested.
Thank you, Mr. Tillerson. I admire your stamina. You've been through several rounds here. And from my perspective, I hope you understand that my questions, while they may seem tough in some respects, I take my role in advising consent of any nominee really important. And in your case, you have a very unique background coming to this job. So trying to understand, as the person who's going to be the chief advisor to the president-elect in that meetings that you just described when everybody gets around the table, but in foreign policy, it's going to be you. And so I try to get from the past a gleaming of it so I understand where you're going to be in the future. So I hope you understand the nature of my questions. Let me take a quick moment on Cuba. You've heard a lot about Cuba here, maybe disproportionately to the things in the world, but I think it is rewarding a regime when the only way you can do business in Cuba is with Castro's son or son-in-law. They had the two monopolies inside of Cuba that control tourism and everything hotel and tourism related and everything agriculture related, which are the two main areas that people want to do business with in Cuba. And who are they? Not only are they the son and son-in-law, but they are high-ranking officials of the Cuban military. So what do? When we allow business to take place with them and you can only do business with them, I wish you could do business with the average Cuban and empower them and make those economic decisions that would free them in some respects. Then you strengthen what? They are both high-ranking officials of the Cuban military. So you ultimately fund the very oppressive regime that you are trying to get them to change in terms of human rights and democracy. So when you do your bottoms-up review, that's another element I'd like you to take into consideration. Let me ask you this. As you know, following up on Senator Rish's comments on Iran, Iran was designated as state sponsor of terrorism in 1984, following its connection to the 1983 bombings of U.S. Marine personnel in Lebanon, a horrific event. It killed 241 U.S. service personnel. That label on Iran has unfortunately not changed. And just this June, the State Department, in its annual report on global terrorist activity, listed Iran as the state sponsor of terrorism. The report indicated that Iran in 2015, quote, provided a range of support, including financial training, equipment to terrorist groups around the world, including Hezbollah. It has been brought to my attention that between 2003 and 2005, ExxonMobil sold $53 million worth of chemicals and fuel additives to Iranian customers. Alarmingly, Exxon did not originally disclose this business with Iran in its annual 10K annual report with the SEC in 2006. ExxonMobil only disclosed this information to the SEC after receiving a letter from the SEC asking for explanations. The Securities and Exchange Commission asked Exxon to explain these dealings because Iran at the time was, quote, subject to export controls imposed on Iran as a result of its actions in support of terrorism and in pursuit of weapons of mass destruction and missile programs. They went on to say, we note that your Form 10K does not contain any disclosure about your operations in Iran, Syria, and Sudan, close quote. Exxon's response has been that the transactions were legal because Infinium, the chemicals joint venture with Shell, was based in Europe and the transaction did not involve any U.S. employees. In other words, this would clearly seem as a move designed to do business with Iran to evade sanctions on Iran. So I have a few questions for you to the extent that you're familiar with this, of the customer at the end of that deal and whether you can ascertain that Exxon was either knowingly or unknowingly potentially funding terrorism. One of the customers in this sales to Iran was the Iranian National Oil Company, which is wholly owned by the Iranian government. The Treasury Department of the United States has determined that that entity is an agent or affiliate of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. The IRGC is Iran's main connection to its terrorist activities around the world and pledge allegiance to Iran's supreme leader, the Ayatollah. In other words, the IRGC and its foreign arm, the Quds Force, are the Ayatollah's army. In fact, they are currently in Syria right now helping Assad remain in power. So can you tell the committee whether these business dealings with Iran did not fund any state-sponsored terrorism activities by Iran?
Senator, as I indicated earlier, I do not recall the details of the circumstances around what you just described. The question would have to go to ExxonMobil for them to be able to answer that.
You have no recollection of this as the CEO?
I don't recall the details around it, no, sir.
This would be a pretty big undertaking to try to circumvent U.S. sanctions by using what may or may not, I'm not ready to make that determination, a legal loophole to do so, but it would be pretty significant. It wouldn't come to your level? It wouldn't come to your level that the Securities and Exchange Commission raise questions with your company about lack of disclosure?
That would happen. I'm just saying I don't recall 2006 would have been the first year that I would have been looking at those things. I just don't recall this one is all I'm saying.
Do you recall whether ExxonMobil was doing business with 3 different state sponsors of terrorism, including Iran, in the first place?
No, I don't recall. Again, I'd have to look back and refresh myself.
I would hope you would do so, and I would be willing to hear your response for the record, because I think it's important. Regardless of moving to a different thing, because it's all my sanctions field, I'm trying to understand that, and this is an expression of that. Regardless of whether or not you have read the bill that Senator Cardin and I and others have sponsored on a bipartisan basis, do you believe that additional sanctions on Russia, in view of everything that has been ascertained, is in fact appropriate? You may view that some may be more useful than others, but do you believe that any additional actions in terms of sanctions on Russia is appropriate for their actions?
Well, I would like to reserve my final judgment on that until I have been fully briefed on the most recent cyber events. I've not had that briefing, and as I indicated, I like to be fully informed on decisions.
I appreciate that. I would just say that in the public forum that you could read or any other citizen could read, it's pretty definitive by all of the intelligence agencies of what they did. So it just seems to me that while I know you're cautious and you want to deal with the facts, that's the essence of you being an engineer and a scientist, and I respect that. There are some things in the public realm for which one can deduce and make a decision, and I'd love to hear your response to that, at least for the record as well.
Well, when I know there is additional information and there are additional facts in the classified area, I would wait until I've seen all the facts. If I knew that there's nothing else to be learned and this is all the facts and there's nothing else out there, then I would say I could make a determination because this is all we know. But as I've been told, at least I'm aware, there is a classified portion of this report that when I have the opportunity, I look forward to examining that, and then I'll have all the information in front of me.
I have one final question, Mr. Chairman, but I'll wait for my next term. So,
in order for efficacy to prevail, please go on.
So, in light of efficacy, so here's characterizes, in essence, my big question for you. My question about you. It's an article that appeared in Time magazine. And I really want to hear your honest response to this. And I'm going to quote from the article. It says, "What the Russians want from Tillerson is bigger than sanctions relief. They want to see a whole new approach to American diplomacy, one that stops putting principles ahead of profits, focusing instead on getting the best political bargain available, and treats Russia as an equal. Quote, for the next 4 years, we can forget about America as the bearer of values," said Vladimir Milov, a former Russian energy minister who went to join the opposition. "America is going to play the deal game under Trump. And for Putin, that's a very comfortable environment," he told the radio host this week in Moscow. "It's an environment where statesmen sit before a map of the world and they haggle over pieces available to them, much like Putin," this is the article and not me, "like Putin and Tillerson did while weighing the oil fields of Texas against Russia's reserves in the Arctic. Through the canny eyes of a political deal maker, many of Washington's oldest commitments in Europe and the Middle East could come to be seen in much the same way, as a stack of bargaining chips to be traded rather than principles to be upheld." I'd like to hear your that's not you being quoted, but that's a characterization that was in one article, but beyond that, it's a characterization I've heard many times. And so to me, that comes down to the core of everything I've tried to deduce in my line of questioning, and I want to give you an open opportunity to respond to it.
Well, I haven't seen the article in its entirety, but I'll just deal with the quotes that you read. If you conclude that that's the characterization of me, then I have really done a poor job today. Because what I have hoped to do in today's exchange on the questions is to demonstrate to you that I'm a very open and transparent person. I do have strong values that are grounded in my American ideals and beliefs and the values that I was raised with, and they're underpinned. I've spoken to the Boy Scouts this morning earlier. They're underpinned by those same values: duty to God and country, duty to others, and duty to yourself. And that has guided my life for all of my life. And it will guide my values, and it will guide the way in which I will represent the American people if given the chance to do so. I understand full well the responsibilities and the seriousness of it. I don't view this as a game in any way, as that article seems to imply. So I hope, if I've done nothing else today, you at least know me better.
Thank you. If there's no objection, there has been a response from ExxonMobil that my staff gave me relative to the Sudan, Iran, Syria issue, and I'm just going to enter it to the record if that's okay for everyone to be able to peruse. With that, Senator Rubio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Tillerson, for your patience. You can see the finish line from here, I think. We're almost there. I really just have 4 clarifications. I don't think they're going to take very long, just going back to some of the things. On the sanctions piece, to build on what Senator Menendez had just asked you, it's my recollection that your testimony earlier this morning about, I had asked specifically about sanctions on those who conducted cyber attacks against the United States, not specifying Russia in particular, just a bill that said anyone who was guilty of cyber attacks against our infrastructure would be subject to sanctions. And your answer, if I recall correctly, was that we would want to weigh other factors before, that's why you wanted the flexibility and not the mandatory language, because there may be other factors to take into account, such as our trade and economic relations with that country or actor before we chose whether or not to use a tool such as sanctions. So in essence, even if you had information available to you or will in the future about specific actors, that alone may not be enough based on that testimony. There are other factors that you would want to take into account before making your recommendation to the President about whether or not to institute sanctions. Is that a correct characterization?
Yes, it is. And I think the way I would try to explain this, at least why I'm taking this position, sanctions are not a strategy. Sanctions are a tactic. And if we are going to engage, and I'll use Russia in this case, but I can use any other country that these sanctions would apply to, and if we're going to engage in trying to address a broad array of serious issues, I'd like to have this as a tool, as a tactic. If it's already played, it's not available to me as a tactic in advancing those discussions and trying to come to some conclusion that best serves America's interests and America's national security interests. It's a powerful tool. I'd like to be able to use it tactically. And if it's already been played, it's not available to me to use tactically.
Okay. The second is a clarification of an exchange you had with Senator Portman about an hour or so ago. He asked you whether there was basically any sort of cooperation with Iran where we may have a confluence confronting ISIS, working with Iran to confront ISIS. Your answer was that's an area requiring exploration. As I indicated, that's where we have to find a way to engage in the overall process. Just to clarify, does that mean you would be open potentially to working with Iran on issues that we have potentially in common, such as defeating ISIS?
Well, defeating ISIS is the one that's right in front of us, and we're already cooperating with them in Iraq.
Okay. The third question has to do with sanctions on Crimea. Again, Senator Portman's question. I believe your answer was, and I caught it on television, I had just stepped out at the tail end of the first round, and he asked, and I think your testimony was along the lines of, we won't change anything right away after we examine the situation, but embedded in that was the notion that potentially at some point there could be an arrangement in which the United States would recognize Russia's annexation of Crimea if the government in Kiev signed off on it or accepted it as part of a broader deal to ensure peace and stability. Is that an accurate assessment of the testimony as I heard it?
I think what I was trying to recognize is that since that was territory that belongs to Ukraine, Ukraine will have something to say about it in the context of a broader solution to some kind of a lasting agreement. I'm not saying that that is on the table. I'm merely saying I don't think that's ours alone to decide.
Okay, here's my last clarification. and it's more about the hearing here today in general. When, in the end of the last round, at the end of the questioning, you said that there was some misunderstanding in alluding to human rights. You said we share the same values, but that you are clear-eyed and realistic about it, end quote. So I wanted you to understand the purpose of the questions I've asked you today, because they are in pursuit of clarity and realism. On the clarity front, I was very pleased when your statement today used the term moral clarity, because I think we've been missing that for the last 8 years. And that's why I asked you about whether Vladimir Putin was a war criminal, something that you declined to label him as. I asked about China, whether they were one of the worst human rights violators in the world, which, again, you didn't want to compare them to other countries. I asked about the killings in the Philippines. I asked about Saudi Arabia being a human rights violator, which you also declined to label them. And the reason was not because I was trying to get you involved in the name of international name-calling, but for the sake of name-calling, but because in order to have moral clarity, we need clarity. We can't achieve moral clarity with rhetorical ambiguity. I also did it in pursuit of realism, because here's what's realistic. You said that you didn't want to label them because it would somehow hurt our chances to influence them or our relationship with him, but here's the reality. If confirmed by the Senate, and you run the Department of State, you're going to have to label countries and individuals all the time. You expressed today support for the Magnitsky Act, which specifically labels individuals and sanctions them. You are going to have to designate nations as sponsors of terrorism or organizations as terror groups. Again, a label. And one that I think a lot of us care about is the Trafficking in Persons report, which specifically labels countries and ranks them based on how good a job they're doing. And that one really concerns me, because in that one, over the last year, there's evidence that the rankings and the tier system has been manipulated for political purposes. They upgraded Cuba, they upgraded Malaysia, because we're working with them now to improve relations, and we didn't want to have a label out there that hurt the chances of doing that. And so that's why I think it's important for you to, but here's the last reason. You gave the need for a lot more information in order to comment on some of these. And believe me, I understand that it's a big world, there's a lot of topics. These were not obscure areas. And I can tell you that, number one, the questions I asked did not require access to any sort of special information that we have. All these sources were built on voluminous open source reporting, rights groups, the leaders sometimes themselves when it comes to the Philippines, the State Department, et cetera. And so we're not going off news reports alone. But the selling point for your nomination has been that while you don't have experience in government and in foreign policy, you have traveled the world extensively. You have relationships all over the world, and you have a real understanding of some of these issues as a result of that. Yet, today I've been unable to get you to acknowledge that the attacks on Aleppo were conducted by Russia, and that in fact they are or would be considered under any standard human rights, that somehow you're unaware about what's happening in the Philippines, that you don't or are not prepared to label what's happening in China and Saudi Arabia, a country that, my understanding, you're quite aware of. Women have no rights in that country. That's well documented. If you visited there, and anyone who has, they would know. Now, I want you to understand this too, and I said this to you when we met. I have no questions about your character, your patriotism. You don't need this job. You didn't campaign for this job. It sounds like a month and a half ago someone had said that you were going to be up here today. You'd say, that's not true. That's not what there's only one reason for you to be sitting behind that table today, and that's your love for this country and your willingness to serve it. And I do admire that. I do. But I also told you when we met that the position that you've been nominated to is, in my opinion, the second most important position in the U.S. government, with all due respect to the Vice President. It is the face of this country for billions of people, for hundreds of millions of people as well, and particularly for people that are suffering and they're hurting. For those people, those 1,400 people in jail in China, those dissidents in Cuba, the girls that want to drive and go to school, they look to the United States. They look to us, and often to the Secretary of State. And when they see the United States is not prepared to stand up and say, yes, Vladimir Putin is a war criminal, Saudi Arabia violates human rights, we deal with these countries because they have the largest nuclear arsenal on the planet, because China is the second largest economy in the world, because Saudi Arabia is a strategic partner in what's happening in the Middle East, but we still condemn what they do. It demoralizes these people all over the world, and it leads people to conclude this, which is damaging, and it hurt us during the Cold War, and that is this: America cares about democracy and freedom as long as it's not being violated by someone that they need for something else. That cannot be who we are in the 21st century. We need a Secretary of State that will fight for these principles. That's why I asked for these questions. That's why I asked those questions, because I believe it's that important for the future of the world that America lead now more than ever. So I thank you for your patience today.
Thank you, sir. Senator Sheen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for giving us some additional time. I want to just comment on Senator Rubio's statement and Senator Menendez's, because I think the concern that I have listening to your testimony today is that your eloquence about the values and the principles of this country can't be denied, but many of those statements have been undercut by earlier statements by the President-elect. And so what I want to know is which values are going to prevail. And are you deferring on answering some of these questions because of concerns about statements that the President-elect has made? So I will make that as a rhetorical statement. I don't know that you need to respond to that unless you would like to. But I do think that's a concern that I have listening to the discussion today. I want to go back to nonproliferation because it got short shrift. The 5 most recent U.S. presidents, including Barack Obama, George W. Bush, Bill Clinton, George H.W. Bush, and Ronald Reagan, have negotiated agreements with Russia to ensure strategic stability and to reduce nuclear stockpiles. I think you said this morning earlier that you do support the New START Treaty, which is the most recent of those agreements. But more broadly, do you support the long-standing bipartisan policy of engaging with Russia and other nuclear-armed states to verifiably reduce nuclear stockpiles?
Yes, I do.
Thank you. And I want to go back to climate change because I appreciate your recognition about the science and your concern as an engineer about wanting to have scientific evidence. I would argue that we have a lot of scientific evidence. In New Hampshire, we have a Sustainability Institute at the University of New Hampshire that produced a report in 2014 that pointed out the impacts of climate change in New Hampshire and the New England region. And I won't read all of those, but 2 that I thought were most alarming is that for the New England region as a whole, right now, the majority of our winter precipitation is rain. It's not snow. That's having a huge economic impact in New Hampshire and other parts of New England on our ski industry, on snowmobiling, on our maple sugaring industry, and also that by 2070, New Hampshire will begin to look like North Carolina. So there are tremendous economic implications of that, as well as implications on everything from, our wildlife, our moose, our trout, to our fauna, and lots of other things that affect the state. Now, I do appreciate your comments about being at the table as we continue to negotiate around climate change. In 2009, the U.S. government, along with other nations that are part of the Group of 20, the G20, agreed to phase out fossil fuel subsidies. I, for one, believe that the science shows that fossil fuels have contributed dramatically to climate change. And while much of the responsibility for this G20 agreement falls on the Treasury Department, the State Department also does have a role in overseeing the objective. So I really have a 2-part question here with respect to subsidies for fossil fuels. The first is, at this time when many of our oil companies, particularly large oil companies like Exxon, are reaping very good profits, do we really need to continue these subsidies? And second, if confirmed, how would you as Secretary of State help to fulfill our international commitment to phase out those fossil fuel subsidies?
Well, and that's, since it's a 2-part question, obviously the first part I'm happy to offer a personal view on, even though it's not within State Department's role to make that judgment. This just comes from my understanding of how the various tax elements in the tax code treat certain investments, certain research credits, and whatnot. And I'm not aware of anything the fossil fuel industry gets that I would characterize as a subsidy. Rather, it's simply the application of the tax code broadly, tax code that broadly applies to all industry. And it's just the way the tax code applies to this particular industry. So I'm not sure what subsidies we're speaking of, other than if we want to eliminate whole sections of the tax code, then they won't apply to any other industries as well. I just say that as a kind of a broad observation. So as to the State Department's role then in participating in summits or discussions around others taking similar action, it would be with that view in terms of how we're going to apply things at home, because I think the President-elect's made clear in his views and his whole objective of his campaign and putting America first, that he is not going to support anything that would put U.S. industry in any particular sector at a disadvantage to its competitors outside of the U.S., whether it's automobile manufacturing or steel making or the oil and gas industry. So it would depend upon how the domestic part of that and how that decision is made by others would then inform the positions that I would be carrying forward in the State Department.
Well, so then, I know you said earlier that you don't want to talk about tax reform, which I appreciate, but if we assume that the way the tax code is written, it provides additional subsidies, and I would argue that they are subsidies, to oil companies and the fossil fuel industry, should we, if we're going to comply with the 2009 agreement with the G20, should we then think about, as we're looking at tax reform and rewriting the tax code, that we change that aspect of the tax code in order to deal with our commitment to phase out those subsidies?
Well, I'd really have to defer to Treasury and others that are going to undertake that exercise, as well as the other agencies that will inform the State Department's view of how that compares to what others are doing to live up to their commitment to phase out, quote, subsidies as well. So it's hard for me to make a judgment on whether I think we should do this until I know what's the parallel in the agreement that other countries are going to do as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Cardin.
Well, first, let me start off again by thanking Senator Corker for the time that's been allowed. I think Senator Coons has a question or two, if we could yield perhaps for
Absolutely.
Senator Coons.
Senator Coons.
If I might, Mr. Tillerson, we spoke in my office about countering violent extremism and fragile states, and a number of other senators have asked questions about 3 countries, Turkey, Egypt, and the Philippines, but there's many others we could be focusing on, that have been partners of ours or allies of ours, and where they've recently turned away from democratic norms and have cracked down on civil society, on press freedom, on human rights. And you talked with me, and you've also said here that in some instances we have to set aside, for the moment, human rights, civil liberties, democracy as our #1 goal when our national security is at risk. And I just wanted to ask you about to what extent you think the actions to curtail human rights and press freedom by some governments actually fuel instability or strengthen terrorist threats. We talked in particular about Nigeria, or places where human rights violations might actually increase the risk of instability, and what strategy you would follow to prevent partners like Turkey, Egypt, the Philippines, and others from sliding further away from sharing some of our core values in terms of democracy and human rights.
Well, I certainly would take no exception to what you've posed, that to the extent human rights either deteriorate, oppression increases, or to the extent it exists and it's not addressed, it foments within the population. There's no question about it, and that over time, it's going to take its effect in terms of the stability of the country. So I think, as I've talked about these competing priorities, and I made clear earlier that these most precious of human values that we advocate for are never absent. They're never absent. And they really are only going to be trumped, so to speak, when there are serious national security concerns. And if we are engaged with a quote, partner today, and that's why I talked about sometimes people are partners, sometimes they're adversaries, sometimes they're friends, sometimes they're friends and partners. But if we're engaged in an area of where this relationship and what we are pursuing is in the national security interest, the values stay with us. But we may not be able to assert those values at this time. It doesn't mean they're gone. It doesn't mean we don't talk about them. It doesn't mean we dismiss them. We just may not be, it may not be in our interest to condition our national security pursuits on a country making certain commitments around oppression and human rights. These are the most difficult of choices. They're the most difficult choices. But we have to be very clear about what the objective is.
Thank you. I have a few more questions. I'll try and move through them quickly if I could. I believe that LGBTQ rights are human rights, that gay rights are human rights. And in a number of meetings with African heads of state, I've advocated for them to push back on actions where they have engaged in preventing people from meeting, from advocating, where they've been physically abused or tortured. I'll never forget meeting in my office in Delaware with a woman from Zimbabwe who'd been given asylum in the United States after being tortured in Zimbabwe because of who she loved. Do you believe gay rights are human rights, and is that a piece of our human rights advocacy agenda around the world?
American values don't accommodate violence or discrimination against anyone. That's part of that American values that we project.
Could I press you for a more specific question, sir? I was encouraged by your a tough leadership moment at the Boy Scouts, and I simply wanted to reassert that in my work around the world, although not always easy or comfortable, it's, I think, important that we include respect for the whole range of people's relations in our menu of how we define human rights. Let me ask you about support for foreign assistance. Others have asked about it before, but both Condoleezza Rice and Bob Gates, former leaders who've introduced and spoken in support of you, agree that diplomacy and development have to be equal to defense. And in our total budget, it's about 50% is DOD and about 1% State Department, USAID. Are you going to press in partnership with those of us in Congress who are committed to making foreign aid transparent, accountable, and efficient to sustain our investments in development and diplomacy?
I think to quote General Jim Mattis, I think he said, if the State Department doesn't get the money it needs, then I have to buy more ammunition. And so I think clearly the recognition of the importance of ensuring the resources are available to advance our foreign policy and diplomacy goals are important and elevated to a level that even by the nominee of the Secretary of Defense is recognized.
There are at least, I think, 6 non-career ambassadors who've reached out to you for some consideration. They're in allied countries, not partner countries, allied countries. And because of some of their visa rules, they can't stay on as private citizens more than a few months. And they were hoping to be able to stay through the end of the school year in accommodation for their family concerns. I hope you'll take that seriously. In previous transitions, even with a difference in party registration, non-career ambassadors have been considered on a case-by-case basis for some clemency for family reasons to stay through the end of the school year, and I hope you'll seriously consider that.
I'm aware that certain people have petitioned for a review, and I think there's a process that's underway. While I've been preparing for these hearings, I've not been directly engaged in it.
I appreciate your attention to these hearings, but I would be grateful for any consideration. My last question, as you've cited, there's a whole string of important presidential legacies around development and foreign assistance. AGOA in the Clinton administration, PEPFAR, and the Millennium Challenge Corporation, which I think have been terrific initiatives of the Bush administration, Feed the Future, Power Africa, and the global health security initiatives in the Obama administration. Part of what has built a good agenda for us around the world, the developing world, is that the best ideas of previous administrations have been sustained. Are you familiar with the Young African Leadership Initiative, or YALI, which brings some of the most promising young Africans to the United States for a summer to meet with civil society leaders, business leaders, elected leaders around the country? Are you familiar with Power Africa? I believe you are. It's been discussed before. And with the Global Health Security Initiative. And are these the sorts of things you'll seriously consider sustaining in the future?
I think all of those have proven to be extremely valuable programs, successful programs. We need to look for the successful programs, understand why they're successful, and how can they be replicated in other areas, perhaps either addressing other geographic areas or addressing other issues that we want to advance.
Mr. Tillerson, thank you for your testimony in front of the committee today, and I appreciate the opportunity to hear your views and look forward to the opportunity to continue our work together.
Thank you, and if I could, since he has been very busy and getting ready for this hearing, we spent some time talking to the transition team about some of the ambassadors and others that have hardship, and I know there's been something set up where they can, in fact, petition even before he comes into office. So hopefully some of that is being accommodated. And I want to thank you and Senator Kane and others for bringing it to my attention. Senator Markley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much. President-elect Trump has argued that the United States should again waterboard suspected terrorists. Yesterday, Senator Sessions said that that would be illegal, and General Mattis has said that it would be ineffective. Will you advise, Mr. Tillerson, President-elect Trump, that torture in any form is illegal, immoral, and ineffective?
Well, I think others have opined on that sufficiently, and I wouldn't disagree with what they've said.
So you agree with what they said?
I would agree with what they've said.
Okay, thank you. I think that's important. Now, last year in the world, 1/2 of all new electricity which was installed was renewables. 1/2, all new electricity in the world. And China has announced that it is now going to invest $360 billion in renewable energy in its country. The global climate agreement that was reached in Paris is driving much of this investment, but if the United States does not take advantage of this global market, which is going to open up, it's going to mean that we're going to lose jobs here in the United States. We now have 300,000 people in the wind and solar industry in the United States and only 65,000 coal miners who are left. So this sector is growing and growing, and the Chinese clearly want to get the lion's share of it. Can you talk a little bit about how you see this renewable energy revolution as a job-creating engine for the United States and as a way of dealing with the commitments which the United States has made in Paris to the reduction of its greenhouse gases?
Well, I think this is largely a trade issue, one of America's manufacturing investments and competitiveness. And I think to the extent we can let free market forces work, then I would expect American companies to be competitive in participating in this growing market. But this will be subject to trade agreements, perhaps, or just subject to a continuation of free and open trade to be a supplier to these countries that are installing this significant capacity. There's been significant capacity already installed in the U.S., but as you point out, there's a growing market out there as a result of this agreement. So I think it's really a question for the U.S. private sector, working with the administration and the Commerce Department and others as to ensuring that there's no trade obstacles to their ability to participate should they choose to do so.
You were quoted a few years ago as saying, quote, energy made in America is not as important as energy simply made wherever it is most economic in the world. From this committee's perspective, we look at the foreign policy of the United States and we feel great responsibility for the young men and women who we export over to the Middle East to defend our country, and these ships of oil that keep coming back into the United States, and we're still importing 5 million barrels of oil a day, meaning that we don't have it here, but we continue to import it. Could you talk about this view that you have that an American-made barrel of oil is no different than a barrel of oil made overseas? Because from our perspective, the issue of importation of oil ties us into policies, into regions, into countries that we would otherwise never really have to give the weight of importance to that we now do, just because of the fact that they have oil.
Well, I think the context in which that statement was made, because I made it often at the time, was that anything that puts more supply onto the global market means the global market is less dependent on any single source. So a greater diversity of supply, and I think it was made probably in the context of promoting America fully developing our own natural resources, and America being willing to put its supply into the global market as well. So it was just an observation that to the extent you have more supply from more sources, you have a more stable market, less reliance on any particular part of the world.
And I understand that from an ExxonMobil corporate perspective, that a barrel of oil is a barrel of oil wherever it is produced in the world and it's flooding out onto the market. But on the other hand, we have this issue of the impact which importation of oil has on the United States. So would you agree that it is in America's best interest that we reduce consumption of foreign oil so that we are not dependent upon that extra barrel of oil wherever it's being produced in the world?
Senator, you're getting into areas that are the purview of other agencies, but I just make the observation that anything we did to prohibit the availability of supplies to the United States would, in all likelihood, put the U.S. at a competitive disadvantage.
Well, I don't think it's outside of the purview of the State Department, because where we import oil from, the countries, Saudi Arabia, other countries in the Middle East, Northern Africa that we import oil from, that then implicates our foreign policy. Your attitude, or whoever is the Secretary of State's attitude towards that country. So it goes to the question of, should we reduce the demand for oil so that it increases the leverage of a Secretary of State when they're talking to the leaders of this country, because we're telling them we don't need their oil in order to run our own country?
I would not agree with that conclusion.
Well, how would you describe our need to import oil and allowing that country to have that as one of the discussion points as you're sitting there with them?
Well, it's back to where you started the conversation. Once a barrel of oil is loaded on a tanker, a barrel of oil is a barrel of oil. And the end consumer doesn't really care where that barrel of oil came from, because it's going to be priced in a global market. As long as they have free access to the barrels and they have the ability to shop around for barrels, that is what's most supportive of their economic activity.
Yeah, but we're not just talking about economic activity any longer, Mr. Tillerson. We're now talking about the impact which that barrel of oil coming in from Saudi Arabia, coming in from another country, has upon the leverage they have over any discussion that the United States is having with that country about other issues. And it's on the table even as we're asking them to give us help in other issue areas. So I'm not just talking about what the global price of oil may be. I'm also talking about where that barrel of oil comes from, and that the less it comes from a country that we don't want to allow them to use oil as a leverage point, is the more leverage the Secretary of State or the President will have in telling them, we don't need you. We don't need your oil to run our country. We are energy independent. So do you think that energy independence, again, should be our goal, and that the 5 million barrels of oil that we're still importing should be something that we're trying to keep out of our country's economic system?
No, I have never supported energy independence. I have supported energy security. And I guess if, to go to your concerns, our largest supplier of imported oil is Canada.
No, I appreciate that, but we still...
So I don't know whether we feel hostage to them or not.
Well, I don't know. Well, I appreciate that, but I also appreciate the fact that we're still importing from Saudi Arabia and other countries in the Middle East. And I do feel that that's unnecessary if we could develop our capacity within our own country to be able to develop oil. So Canada is one thing, Saudi Arabia is another thing altogether. And I just don't think that a barrel of oil is a barrel of oil. I think it has real consequences when it's coming from a country that has itself a strategic vulnerability that can be bolstered by the fact that we need, or other countries need, their oil. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Markley.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. In regard to North Korea, we have had a lot of concerns about their long-term expansion of their missile program, missiles gaining more and more range. Should America put down a line in terms of them testing very long-range missiles? And if North Korea violates that line, what should the U.S. do?
Well, I think the UN resolutions have already put down some pretty hard lines, and North Korea has continued to violate those, both in terms of conducting nuclear tests as well as conducting the launch of delivery systems as well. So we really already passed that point.
Meaning, well, my question wasn't in context of the UN, but in the context of whether the U.S. should lay down a line and respond if it's crossed, because our security is more and more endangered as the range gets longer. I take your answer to be one way of saying, no, there's probably nothing we can do?
No, you shouldn't take my answer in that regard at all. We need to work closely with our allies in the area, Japan, South Korea in particular, because anything we do will certainly have a profound impact on them. And anything that we might consider and what all of our alternatives might be would require a careful conversation at the National Security Council in terms of our capabilities, which we certainly have the capabilities to bring a missile test down. But how and what might be the consequences of that would require careful thought. So I'm not rejecting that as an option. I'm just not prepared to sign up for it today.
Fair enough. Let me turn to Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has been utilizing cluster munitions in Yemen. Much of the world has said these are terrible weapons to use because they have a range of fuses and they can often go off months or years after they've been laid down. These are the cluster bombs. You're familiar with them. They've also been targeting civilians. How should the U.S. respond to those actions?
Well, I would hope that we could work with Saudi Arabia, perhaps by providing them better targeting intelligence, better targeting capability, to avoid mistakenly identifying targets where civilians are impacted. So that's an area where I would hope that cooperation with them could minimize this type of collateral damage.
How about on the cluster munition side?
Could you ask the question?
How about in regard to the use of cluster munitions?
Well, I'd have to examine what our past policy has been. I don't want to get out ahead of it. We've made commitments in this area. I don't want to get out ahead of anyone on that.
I do think this is a little bit of an example that my colleague from Massachusetts was pointing to, because we've often been reluctant to put as much pressure on states that we are dependent upon for oil than in situations with states where we're not dependent on oil. So there's this, sometimes economists refer to a shadow cost. Some of the studies that have been done in think tanks place a shadow cost on gasoline of imported oil because of the type of national security apparatus we need to make sure we sustain access, secure supply, to quote your words. of $5 to $10 a gallon. And I think that's where Senator Markey was driving, that there is a distinction between an imported gallon and a domestically produced gallon. I don't need you to respond to that, but I just wanted to amplify his point that for many of us there is a significant difference between an imported gallon and a domestic gallon. I wanted to turn to Equatorial Guinea. Senator brought this up earlier today about the corruption of the leadership of that particular country. The President for Life, President Obiang, has become exceedingly rich, and part of the way that he's become exceedingly rich is the payments that Exxon has made have gone to his family's accounts rather than going to the national treasury. What are your thoughts on why Exxon participated in that, which continued in time that you were in the leadership of the company?
Senator, I'm familiar with the circumstance you're talking about. That was the subject of an investigation by the Judiciary Committee. There were no findings that Exxon had committed any wrong or broken any laws at the end of that investigation. In terms of the payments that ExxonMobil would make in any arrangement, a contract in any country, would be no different than they are made with domestic producers here in the U.S. that are operating on federal lands. There's royalty and there's taxes paid to the Treasury. What the government does with those monies once the company pays those is up to the government. Obviously, the U.S. government distributes those funds responsibly. Some countries, I understand, do not. In ExxonMobil's engagement in countries like this, though, I do think that on the whole there are positive benefits to the people of the country in terms of job creation that occurs because of the activity, employment that occurs because of the activity, and I'm not in any way suggesting that that mitigates the corruption in the country, but that it is not without benefit and is not without having American values on the ground in those countries as well. And this is true not just of the extractive industries portion or sector, but it's true of any American business that may be engaging in business activities in countries which have very poor governance structures at the top.
You mentioned that royalties and taxes should go to the government, but in this case, Exxon made the payments to a private account controlled by the President. Do you see anything wrong with that?
I'd have to review for my memory the circumstance you're talking about. My recollection is that that account was designated as the government's account, and I think when it was discovered that the account either may or may not have been a valid account, it was closed.
There are also a number of contracts that Exxon did with companies controlled by the family members of the President. This included building leases and land leases and a series of other contracts, the net effect of which was transferring a lot of wealth to a President for life, someone who has no interest in democratic principles. The State Department has reported on this for many, many years, each year doing this report on Equatorial Guinea. 2003 states there is little evidence the government used the country's oil wealth for the public good. The oil wealth is concentrated in the hands of the top government officials, while the majority of the population remained poor. The State Department actually cut their foreign economic assistance to the country because of the massive corruption and control by this family. And it ties in earlier. One of my colleagues mentioned a situation where I believe a whole series of very expensive sports cars were being loaded onto a plane to be flown into Equatorial Guinea. But those weren't being paid for by U.S. foreign assistance. Those were being paid for by diverted oil royalties. And I think it does raise not just a legal question, and you've noted that no legal violation was found, but it certainly raises a moral question about how one engages a country and increases the power of leaders who are doing nothing to elevate the quality of life of their citizens. Do you share any of that perspective?
Senator, again, my recollection is that in all of the examples that you mentioned, they were investigated. There were no violations of law. During my time at ExxonMobil, ExxonMobil took at that time, and I expect still do, very seriously the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and has in place processes to ensure that the corporation and all of its employees remained in full compliance. Any suspected violations were always fully investigated, and if anything was found, the process would have dictated a full investigation, a resolution, and if required, a self-reporting process. So I think the corporation had very strong procedures in place to ensure compliance, and I think the examples you're giving, while I understand the concern you're expressing, indicated that the process to ensure there was no violation of Foreign Corrupt Practices Acts did perform and did withstand that investigation.
So I'm going to conclude with just a thought about this. In the course of this conversation, you've spent the whole day answering our questions, and I appreciate that very much. And with my colleagues, I appreciate your willingness to serve. The process of vetting in the Senate is a challenging one, and you've appeared with dignity. I do have remaining concerns from some of the conversation from today. When Senator Shaheen raised the question of the National Registry for Muslims, you noted that you needed more information. To me, I'm somewhat disturbed because we are a nation founded on religious freedom, and there is a clarity of, can I complete my sentence, my statement?
I hope it's not paragraphs, but.
No, it's not a paragraph, no. And when Senator Rubio asked about the president of the Philippines slaughtering thousands of people, you said you needed more information. To me, there is a moral dimension to that. And when I raised the issue of bypassing U.S. sanctions and helping Iran, there's a moral dimension to that. And on this issue of strengthening a dictator for life, there is a moral dimension to that. And you came to my office and said, the first thing you said was, I want moral clarity to be a foundation for U.S. policy. I agree with that. I'm not sure we're hearing it in these particular instances.
Thank you. Senator Cardin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, if I could ask consent to put in the record the statement from Publish What You Pay.
Without objection.
And if I could, just to follow up very quickly on a couple points, I'm not going to be asking any questions, but in regards to the issues of transparency and anti-corruption, I just want to comment on the conversations we had in the office, and I really appreciate the conversations we had. We talked about, Mr. Chairman, the Trafficking in Persons Report and the commitment to end modern-day slavery, and how effective it was to have directed goals so countries knew how they could make advancements, so there was a clear path forward. I have suggested, as you know, legislation that would do that for fighting corruption, and I look forward, if you're confirmed, Mr. Tillerson, to working with you as to how we can advance a more effective way to judge how the international community can judge progress in fighting corruption, because every country has a problem, but as you pointed out many times during this hearing, there are countries that are very challenged, and you look for certain standards, as you did as a business person to do business in a country, and the United States should lead the world in developing those standards on corruption. So I look forward to working with you on that issue. And we also talked about transparency in the extractive industries, and I appreciate your candor there as to the usefulness for that to make sure the resources actually get to the people rather than to corrupt leaders. So I thank you on both of those points. I'll make one quick comment about the role of Congress. We've talked about this many times. You're pretty strong about the role to confirm ratified treaties. You've talked very firmly about complying with our laws in regards to Cuba, and you then talk very firmly about having enforceable sanctions. I would just point out, when we do mandatory sanctions or sanctions with tight waiver language, it makes it much more likely we'll have strong enforcement. So I just point that out and hope that we can work together on that. I also want to just acknowledge another role that I play. I'm the ranking Democrat on the Helsinki Commission. Senator Wicker is the chairman of that. It's a commission that deals not just with human rights, but it's known for human rights. It also deals with security and economic issues. And we look forward to working with you, if you're confirmed, at the State Department to advance the congressional role in dealing with the OSCE through the Helsinki Commission. We will be asking you some additional questions for the record. I have not had a chance to ask questions on refugees, and there's some others that I will ask. Senator Gardner and I will ask you questions in regards to Burma. I'm his ranking on the subcommittee for the last Congress, and we have some serious issues about the human rights progress being made in Burma, but we'll ask those questions for the record. I want to thank you for being responsive to our questions today, and thank you for being willing to put up with such a long day. I was commenting to Senator Corker about an hour ago. We passed the new limits on the overtime rules that were adopted by the Department of Labor. So I think we're all entitled to extra pay for the length of the day's hearings. But thank you very much for your attention.
So, Senator Cardin, again, I want to thank you for working in a post-election environment to make sure that this hearing came off in the way that it did today. And I want to thank all the committee members for the way that they conducted themselves, and as they always do, and the fact that we stayed at, I believe, a very high level. I want to thank the nominee for being here today, and I'd just like to make an observation. I've been here 10 years. I don't know how many hearings that I've been to, briefings, people in my office. We take in a tremendous amount of information here. It's very hard to replicate that. Back home, when I'm talking to people, I discuss the fact that being a United States Senator is much like getting a PhD almost on a daily basis, just because of the information flow that we have, the access to intelligence, to the access to brilliant staffers who are constantly emailing us 24/7 with updates. And I just would like to say that we have a man who's come in from the private sector. He spent, I think he was notified, he was selected less than a month ago for this job. And I know there's been some comments about clarity. I've, as I mentioned, been here 10 years. I've seen secretaries of state who come before our committee who've been around for 30 years. When they take questions, they have booklets open and paragraphs written to answer those questions. I think if you look at what's happened today, I don't think there have been any notes referred to. And so to some of my friends on both sides of the aisle that may talk about clarity, which I respect, and I actually think almost every senator here did an outstanding job today. But I hope they will take into account that we have a person who's been wafted in, if you will, from a totally different world, has arrived, has been through briefings, has been through murder boards, has done met with every single member of the committee, and sat here today accepting a 45-minute break for 9 hours and answered questions without any notes. I'm going to leave the record open until the close of business tomorrow for people to continue to ask questions. I know that Mr. Tillerson had planned to be here tomorrow in front of all of us all day if necessary. And I would just urge those who may have had questions about clarity to remember something and then maybe do something. Senators develop pretty strong opinions. And sometimes we express those opinions in a very crisp, direct, strong manner, just to break through the clutter that we have to deal with to make a point. And we've had years of input, and so we develop really strong opinions about what's happening in China as it relates to human rights, what Putin may be doing. Many of us have been to refugee camps. We've seen photos of what's happened in prison camps and what Assad has done to his own people. And so it evokes a clarity of how we feel about what has happened on the ground. A nominee coming in, on the other hand, wants to make sure that he's not getting out over his skis. He's working for a president that he doesn't know that well yet. He's trying to accommodate the fact that, in fact, he's going to be working in an interagency situation to come to conclusions. So I just hope that those things will be taken into account if there are questions about clarity. Mr. Tillerson is an Eagle Scout, a person who's lived an exemplary life. Been at the same company for 41 and a half years, and again, I think has handled himself in a very good manner. So the thing I would ask is, if there are questions about that clarity, contact us, contact the transition team. Give him an opportunity to sit down in front of people and discuss these things, especially in person where the media is not there and every single question is going to be obviously written about in multiple ways. And let's really think about this. This is a very important decision. We have a president-elect who is coming into office also without a great deal of background, and for him to have some in foreign policy, and for him to have someone who he has confidence in, and who's demonstrated that he's very much in the mainstream of foreign policy thinking. But for him to have someone who he has confidence in, who's sitting up under the hood, who's helping him shape his views, to me is something that is very, very important. And my sense is that very quickly on these issues of clarity, the nominee, when exposed to what is happening in the way that all of us have been, will in fact develop that clarity. So I thank you for your time, and the meeting is adjourned.
Well done. It's a good day. See you all later. Sorry you don't have a hearing tomorrow, but now we have a 6 o'clock.
Oh, hold it over?
Anything sensitive or okay, it's just the
We'll drink now, man. Yeah, I'm going to be writing answers in cue cards all day.
So, the first day of Rex Tillerson's confirmation hearing on the books, or in the books. More questioning expected tomorrow when character witnesses testify. You can watch live Thursday on cspan.org. We've been getting your opinions on our Facebook page all day. Here are some of the viewer reactions. Adoro writes that she's been watching the Tillerson hearings on C-SPAN 3. Words I never thought I'd say, you go Marco. Richard has a different view. He writes, I'm a huge Rubio fan, but these were stupid questions. How can Tillerson call Putin a war criminal and then negotiate with Russia as Secretary of State?